The History of the Jesuits. Abbe Vladimir Guettée. Book 3. 1572 to 1598 AD. On the death of Francis Borgia, Poulenc, the secretary of the order, was appointed vicar. He called a congregation for April 12 to elect a general. Two of Ignatius's first companions were still alive, Salmeron and Bobadilla. They were present at the meeting, which also included Canisius, Rabatinira, Passivin, Claude Mathieu, who had played an active part during the League, Olivier Manard, provincial of France, and Everard Mercurian, who was elected. Gregory XIII pointed out Mercurian to the Jesuits as the desired candidate. Poulenc remarked to the Pope himself that he must neither hinder the proceedings of the assembly nor exert pressure on the electors. Meanwhile, at the moment when Passivin began his introductory speech at the opening of the session, Cardinal Como went into the electoral hall and announced the Pope's wish. A deputation of 5 members went to Gregory XIII to inform him of the protest of the assembly. Seeing that he would be as little successful in subduing the Jesuits as Paul IV and Pius V, the Pope feigned concession, on condition that he should be informed of the result of the ballot before it was made public, in case a Spaniard was chosen. He undoubtedly wished to annul the election if it did not correspond to his wishes. The Jesuits understood this, and in order to avoid serious difficulties that might arise from the election of a Spaniard, they elected the Belgian Everard Mercurian. They thus pleased both the Pope, who had indicated this candidate, and Philip II, King of Spain, whose subject Mercurian was. Olivier Manard, formerly provincial of France, was elected assistant of France and Germany and administrator. Mercurian remained general of the order until 1580. The events that took place during this time are closely connected, both with those that preceded and those that followed, during the tenure of General Claudius Aquaviva, who was elected on February 19, 1581. His election was not without intrigue. Caesar Speziano wrote to St. Charles Borromeo on November 2, 1580, "I would like your lordship to think seriously about the election of a new Jesuit general. Your lordship knows how essential it is that the choice should fall on the right person, and especially that measures be taken at the General Assembly to correct the abuses that are being committed in the order. Some of the fathers know this very well and are grieved. If these abuses are concealed, one may fear that things will go from bad to worse, and the prediction of Pius V will come true. We have said that Pope Pius V was greatly concerned about the Jesuits and foresaw that the Church would suffer great harm from them. Later, we will describe the abuses that existed in the Jesuit order itself, and that grew more and more from the time of General Aquaviva." When the latter was elected, Speziano wrote to St. Charles Borromeo on February 23, 1581, "Father Aquaviva has been elected general to the great astonishment of all virtuous people." In another letter he adds, "I commend the Order of Jesus to your prayers, it is in great need of them. Many even fear that it will decline, because of the bad rules that are sown and observed in it." On February 24, Father Adorno, Charles Borromeo's confessor, who was present at the election, wrote to him, "I have not been able to write to your lordship for several weeks, as we have been busy with the election of a new general. It took place last Sunday, and the choice fell on Father Claudius Aquaviva. May God grant him the wisdom and prudence necessary for the management of the order. I deeply regret that the matter was not carried out with that simplicity and purity of views which befit a good monk, and which are so recommended by our rule. Next week they will begin the election of new assistants. If this takes place, according to the intrigues of certain individuals, then we have every reason to fear it as a heavy blow to our cause. May the Lord lay his right hand upon it. I want to return as soon as possible to occupy myself only with my service and the affairs of your clergy. I would be happier if I did not leave at all. The Holy Father is very displeased with us. He showed this clearly when the new general and I came to kiss his feet. I think he will interfere in the election of assistants. If he does not do this, they will not fail to impose unsuitable individuals on us. I do not have the courage to tell you today what caused the confusion in the election of the general. But if it pleases God, I will convey this at a personal meeting with your lordship." The Jesuit historians confess that Gregory XIII was astonished at the election of Aquaviva, and that he said at the first reception of the new general, "How, fathers, have you chosen as your leader a young man who is not yet 40 years old?" The same historians are silent about the rest, and praise the new general so exaggeratedly that they make one doubt the truth of their praises. We left the Jesuits in France at the moment when they were taking, if not a direct, then a very active part in the religious wars, and in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre with their fanatical sermons and their terrible theories regarding the extermination of Protestants. Before his death, Charles IX issued them charters to establish a college in Bourges. On May 25, 1574, 5 days before the moment when he was called to answer before divine justice, this king ordered the Parliament to record his charters, in which he gave the Jesuits permission to establish not only their own colleges, but also monasteries of professors throughout France. Was this patronage of Charles IX flattering to the Jesuits? The Parliament did not obey his order. Henry III, before he had even ascended the throne, issued new charters to the order, which were finally recorded by Parliament with the usual reservations. That is, the Jesuits were admitted to France on condition that they not be Jesuits. Father Auger came to Paris still in the blood of Protestants, and decided to organize there a perpetual adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, in atonement for the blasphemy of the heretics. The Sorbonne was outraged by the Jesuits' intention. It understood that it would be terrible, under the pretext of extraordinary religious ceremonies, to incite the people against the Protestants at a time when they were persecuted throughout France and killed with some kind of frenzy. Dr. René Benoit, in particular, rebelled against Auger's intention. Maldonat defended Father Auger from a theological point of view. Shortly before the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, the Jesuits had settled in Bordeaux in a rather strange manner. In order to open the city to his order, Father Maldonat wrote to Arnold de Pontac, Bishop of Bazas, a native of Bordeaux and a member of a family influential in the Parliament of Guyenne. Arnold de Pontac was a scholar. His studies in Hebrew and Greek had brought him into contact with Maldonat, who was famous for his works in the same field. In his letter to Arnold de Pontac, Maldonat pretended to think that the Bordeaux municipality was proposing to the Jesuits to establish a college in Bordeaux, and asked Pontac to lend his protection, so that the establishment of the college would not be opposed by the Parliament. The Bishop of Bazas was in Rome when he received Maldonat's letter. He did not believe it and wrote to de L'Ange, a councillor of the Bordeaux Parliament, asking for an explanation. In his letter he asked whether it was true that Mr. Bordeaux wished to have a Jesuit college, and he set forth the reasons why this intention should be abandoned in case Maldonat wrote the truth. In this letter he recalled the opposition of the bishop and the clergy, the city and the almshouses of Paris. Those who acted differently, he adds, soon repented, as evidenced by many cities in Italy, which daily complain about the Jesuits, and recently Mr. Avignon sent special men to His Holiness with the request to remove the college from it. If they are admitted, then there is no way to get rid of them and no way to replace them with others. 23. Thus the intrigues of the Jesuits to settle in Bordeaux came to nothing. But they themselves got there with the help of generous donations from some rich patrons. They stirred up such unrest there that Marshal Matignon, governor of Guyenne, was forced to expel them in 1589-24. Thanks to the Lorraines, the Jesuits had a college at Pont-à-Mousson, which the Pope transformed into a university where they could grant degrees. Under Henry III, guided by Father Edmund Auger, the Jesuit order was able to spread throughout the provinces. It had its own college at Dijon. Its first rector was Rickham, whose theological works deserve special praise. Father Auger introduced the Jesuits into Franche-Comté and founded a college at Dole. Cardinal Bourbon established a residence for the professors in Paris, on the Rue Saint-Anthony, now the Lycée Charlemagne. On this occasion, Gregory XIII recommended the Jesuits to Peter Gondi, the Bishop of Paris. This prelate did not inherit the sentiments of Eustace du Bellay, his predecessor. The Gondi family, who had emigrated to France from Italy following Catherine de' Medici, had been bought by that woman, who had showered them with wealth and honors. For the Gondi, the court was an oracle, and as the court patronized the Jesuits, Bishop Peter of Gondi took their side, as he did in one case worthy of mention. Father Maldonat, in his lectures, expounded a doctrine which seemed to the University of Paris to be erroneous, especially on 2 points. First, concerning the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin, and secondly, concerning the duration of the torments in purgatory. Concerning the Immaculate Conception, Maldonat not only maintained that it was an arbitrary opinion, but showed a tendency to reject it entirely as an error. The university, since the Council of Basel, had taught it not as a dogma, but as a pious supposition. In expressing the opposite opinion, Maldonat directly offended the university. The case was brought before the Bishop of Paris, who took the side of the Jesuits in this matter. Maldonat, proud of this decision, became even bolder and ordered a refutation of the opinion of the university to be posted, which appealed to the Sorbonne. The latter intended to discuss Maldonat's opinion, but the Archbishop of Paris forbade it to touch on the matter, under penalty of excommunication. In doing so, Peter Gondi violated the rights of the Sorbonne. The Parliament, to which the case was brought, examined it behind closed doors and condemned the bishop, not for a question of faith, in which the Parliament was incompetent, but for violating the law. Maldonat was forced to retire to Bourges. At the same time that the Jesuits in France were attacking the Immaculate Conception in order to contradict the university, they were defending this teaching in Spain as a dogma in order to contradict the Dominicans, who rejected it. In this dispute, the university turned to Cardinal Bourbon, who bore the title of Guardian of University Privileges, for support. The Jesuits, for their part, turned to the same cardinal who patronized them and petitioned him to admit them to the university. The cardinal took advantage of the university's appeal to him and asked him to consider the Jesuits' request. On this occasion, on July 26, 1575, a general council of all faculties was held, at which it was decided to put the famous question to the Jesuits: "Are you monks or secular clergy?" Their answer would determine how they would be admitted to the ranks of teachers. On August 19th of the same year, 4 Jesuits came to the Sorbonne and appeared before the deputies of the university. Among these Jesuits were Claude Mathieu, nicknamed the Courier of the League, and Odin Pisnat, one of the most ardent Leaguers. They were unable to give a clear answer to the question put to them, and therefore the university, not knowing under what name to admit them into its midst, decided that they could not be included among its members. At the same time, it was decided to write to the Pope and explain its course of action regarding Maldonat. In this letter to the Pope, the university painted the Jesuits in an unflattering light. It accused them of spreading the false doctrine of purgatory in order to induce nobles to donate their property to the Jesuit colleges. The Jesuits asserted that after 10 years the bequeathed property could be given a new purpose, since after 10 years the testators were freed from purgatory and no longer needed prayers. The university added that regarding the Immaculate Conception the Jesuits spoke both for and against, according to the circumstances. We have already said that after posting up notices in Paris that the Blessed Virgin was conceived in original sin, they asserted in Spain that she was conceived without sin, because the Dominicans held the opposite opinion. They obtained from Philip II a decree by which every preacher was obliged to begin his sermon with a special formula, which contained a declaration that the preacher believed as firmly in the Immaculate Conception as in the transubstantiation of the Blessed Sacrament. Thus the Jesuits affirmed now one thing, now another, according to circumstances, and raised to dogma in Spain what they considered an error in Paris. The university reported to the Pope not only about this scandalous contradiction, but also about the Jesuits' penchant for enrichment by all possible means. As for us, the doctors added, we are not a burden to anyone, neither to the churches nor to individuals. We do not violate the order of inheritance. We do not solicit spiritual wills to the detriment of direct heirs. We do not cleverly seize either monasteries or spiritual benefices in order to use their property without bearing the obligations associated with them. We do not pronounce the name of Jesus to deceive the consciences of nobles, forcing them to think that the soul only spends 10 years in purgatory. The charges were serious. Numerous facts, with which we shall present the reader, prove that they were just. The Jesuits, in their defense, sent a secret note to the Pope. The Pope did not think it necessary to express his opinion in the matter. And yet it would seem that it was urgently necessary to decide whether the Jesuits could enjoy spiritual benefices while continuing to adhere to a rule which forbade them to perform public worship, and which thus deprived them of the opportunity of fulfilling the duties connected with the use of these properties. It would also seem that the Pope should decide whether the Jesuits were right in maintaining that after the lapse of 10 years one could possess spiritual property without fulfilling the formal wishes of the testators, on the pretext that these testators had already left purgatory. It is clear that such a view was very useful to them, but was it in agreement with justice? In 1577 and 1578 the Jesuits again tried, but without success, to penetrate the university. The influence of Cardinal Bourbon, who had always taken their side, was shattered by the university charter. While all these disputes were going on, the League had spread throughout France under the name of the Holy Alliance. The Jesuits were at the head of this movement. The Lorraine family was its soul, the Jesuits were its agents. The beginning of the League is usually dated to 1563, and it is believed that the first idea of it arose in Toulouse, where the Jesuits, and especially Father Auger, induced the Catholics to openly wage war on the Protestants. The same ideas of struggle spread throughout all the provinces where the Jesuits were, so that at the moment it remained only to unite these disparate parts in order to form a strongly united and powerful whole. Henry III allowed the League to take shape and grow. Catherine de' Medici, who adhered to the rule, divide in order to rule, could only rejoice at the single combat that was being prepared. When the plan was determined and all the elements were ready, emissaries were scattered throughout France, compelling the people to sign an oath to adhere to the Holy Alliance to the death, for the defense of the faith, the king, and the people, for the restoration of the provinces to their liberties and privileges, and for the extermination of all who interfered with the realization of these objects. The Charter of the League and the oath that accompanied it show that faith was of secondary importance in this matter. The idea was to group all the discontented and use them to raise the family of Lorraine, who aspired to the throne as their legitimate inheritance. This was the true object of the League, and religion was only a pretext. In 1577, the Duke of Guise was elected General of the Holy Alliance. Henry III remained neutral, and his indifference paralyzed the movement. But the death of his brother, the heir to the throne, for the king had no children, roused the Leaguers to action. The King of Navarre, afterwards Henry IV, became heir to the throne. He was a Protestant. This circumstance revived the hopes of the Protestants and the fears of the Leaguers. They decided that they would have to resort to the help of foreigners to prevent Henry of Navarre from bringing heresy to the throne. Emissaries were immediately sent to sound out the Catholic princes. Several Jesuits especially distinguished themselves in the execution of these missions. Since the order, says Étienne Pasquier, is composed of men of all sorts, fit for different things, Father Henry Samier, from the Luxembourg district, was found, a man capable and ready for any contingency. He was sent in 1581 to some Catholic princes to learn their ways of thinking, and it must be said that no better man could have been chosen for this task, for he changed into different forms, disguising himself now as a soldier, now as a priest, now as a common man. Games of dice and cards, and women were as familiar to him as the prescribed prayers, and he said that he did not consider all this a sin, especially since he had in view a good deed and the glory of God. In order not to be recognized, he changed his name and clothes, depending on the country in which he was going to act. Samier, having left Lorraine, traveled through Germany, Italy, Spain, and England. Father Claude Mathieu was commissioned to win over Pope Gregory XIII. Before joining the Holy Alliance, the Duke of Nevers wanted to secure the Pope's approval. Mathieu, who had earned the nickname Courier of the League, set out on his journey. He made 3 or 4 trips to Rome one after another to obtain from the Pope a bull, or at least a charter, or, at worst, a letter to the Duke of Nevers. They say that he did not obtain any documents and received only verbal encouragement and money. Meanwhile, this Jesuit read out the letter in which Gregory XIII advised him to seize the person of Henry III and the fortified cities of France. By virtue of his position, Claude Mathieu enjoyed great influence in the Jesuit order. He was the provincial of France and, under the direction of the general, directed the actions of all his subordinates, who accepted his orders as coming from Jesus Christ himself, according to the rules of the order. Philip II had no need to be as cautious as Gregory XIII. Father Samier had won him over to the side of the Holy Alliance. This king, like his father, dreamed of a universal monarchy. The Jesuits had just sold him the crown of Portugal. In order to preserve some semblance of justice, they had appointed an old cardinal, the king, as a mediator. France also had an old cardinal from the reigning house, Cardinal Charles of Bourbon, who was completely subordinate to the Jesuits. On December 31, 1584, a treaty was concluded by which Cardinal Bourbon was to ascend the throne after the death of Henry III. This treaty was concluded between Philip II and the princes of the House of Lorraine, in the name of the Holy Alliance. These princes expected to receive the throne after the death of the old bachelor cardinal. The Jesuits, whom they patronized, seemed completely devoted to them, but secretly betrayed them and tried only to put the Spanish king on the French throne. Henry III complained to the Pope and General Aquaviva about the fanaticism of the Jesuits. Father Auger, who was personally devoted to the king, did not approve of their passions, although he was a supporter of the League. It is possible that he advised the king to demand that the superiors of the order be French. Aquaviva refused, assuring that the guilty would be punished, and replaced the Lorrainer Claude Mathieu, a provincial, with Odin Pigeon, an even greater fanatic. Henry realized that he would achieve nothing from this side. Then Father Auger advised him to join the Holy Alliance and declare himself its head. He did so, but this ridiculous prank did not change the matter in the least. In 1585, Sixtus V succeeded Gregory XIII. Henry III again complained to the Pope about the Jesuits and repeated his previous request that all the abbots of the Jesuit houses in France should be French, and that no Jesuit should dare to interfere in political affairs. But again he achieved nothing. However, noticing that the order was losing the favor not only of Henry III but also of other kings, who feared Jesuit intrigues, Acquaviva wrote to Claude Mathieu, who was again on his way to Rome, not to leave Loretta, where he was at that moment. Father Samuel was confined to the house of Liege, Luttich, but Edmund Gay Carmelite, the abbot of the Parisian convent of the professors, Roulier, rector of the college of Bourges, Varade, Guignard, Garrett, and many other Jesuits were no less fanatical than their brethren, who were sent into exile only for appearance's sake and because they had compromised the order too much. The general approved of the political conduct of his Jesuits, but he wanted more caution on their part. He wanted the movement to be led by men devoted to the order, but not Jesuits, which was, in general, the order's way of acting in difficult and delicate circumstances. In this way, one could profit by one's luck, but not risk anything if the result of the intrigues was unfavorable. As a skillful politician, Sixtus V did not wish to encourage the League, but he did it a great service by his bull of September 10, 1585, by which he excommunicated the King of Navarre and the Prince of Condé as having turned to schism, and deprived them of all their possessions and rights, especially the right of succession to the throne of France. Both these young princes had embraced Catholicism during the massacre of Saint Bartholomew. Since they had returned to their former faith as soon as they had obtained some freedom, Sixtus V called them schism converts and applied to them, as such, the rules of the Catholic statute. Henry III abandoned the League and joined the King of Navarre, his legitimate heir. From then on he was looked upon as the author of heresies. Father Auger, his confessor, was ordered to leave him. Henry wrote to the Pope and to Acquaviva, asking that his Jesuit be left to him. This request was pretended to be granted, but Auger spoke of the necessity of a temporary absence, went to Italy and settled at Como, where he died. The Jesuits redoubled their zeal after the papal bull and the departure of Auger. Their last apologist confesses that they forgot their monastic calling and led a life half monastic and half military, that they even forgot their vow of obedience to the point of disobeying their general, who foresaw the approaching storms. But this panegyrist presents faith and love of the Church as the causes of the excesses he so cautiously points out. Success blinded the French Jesuits. They considered themselves so powerful that Acquaviva's caution seemed to them cowardice. In 1586, the King of Navarre began open warfare with the League, which had its own troops, its own commander-in-chief, and its own central administration in Paris. This Catholic Salvation Committee consisted of 16 delegates from 16 quarters of Paris. They are known in history under the simple name of the 16. They were led by the Jesuit provincial, Odin Pisnat. Among them were two priests, Pelletier from the Church of St. James and Lincester from the Church of St. Gervas. They often met in the convent of the professors on the Rue St. Anthony, or in the College of Claremont on the Rue St. James. At these meetings the most ardent pamphlets were composed, and the most terrible resolutions were adopted. While the 16 were agitating Paris, Henry III and his minions organized religious processions by day and the most disgusting orgies by night. The King of Navarre, active and ambitious, organized a counter-league, which gained more and more adherents every day. Guise hesitated. The 16 summoned him to Paris. On May 12, 1588, he organized the Day of the Barricades. Henry III fled. In revenge for this, he pretended to be reconciled with the League, and summoned Guise and his brother the Cardinal to Blois to sign the Edict of Union. He signed it on October 18th, and on December 23rd Guise was murdered. The next day the same fate befell his brother, the Cardinal. With this double murder, Henry avenged the Day of the Barricades and the ambitions of the Lorraines. The death of the Guises, the Duke and the Cardinal, struck the Leaguers like thunder, but soon their grief gave way to rage and indignation. The Duke of Mayenne, the Guises' brother, warned in time, fled to Lyons and placed himself at the head of the League. In Paris, preachers exhorted the people to revolt. Henry III vainly declared that he would remain faithful to the Edict of the Union. This declaration was considered a proof of his weakness. The people, says Peter de la Toile, immediately armed themselves and began to watch for the enemy day and night. The 16 unfurled their old banners and began to shout, "Beat, burn, kill, avenge." As usual, in all rebellions and uprisings, evil people played the first roles among the rebels. Then the chiefs began to gather the people in dozens and give them orders. Everyone said that they should give their last farthing and shed their last drop of blood to avenge the tyrant, as they began to call the king in Paris, for the death of the two good princes. And although many decent people from the first and most important citizens of the city did not agree with this, including the chief judges, who had the power on their side if they wanted to use it, but they were suddenly seized with such fear that they followed the harmful advice of the evil rebels. The latter, seeing that they were feared, seized weapons. The first entered the battle and thereby gained the victory. On Thursday, December 29th, as they were leaving the church of St. Bartholomew after the evening service, at which Dr. Leicester had preached, the people tore down the royal coat of arms which was above the entrance to the church, smashed it to pieces, threw it into a ditch and trampled it underfoot, excited by the preacher's speech, who said that this vile Herod, villain Herods, this is how the Jesuits anagrammatized the name of Henri de Valois, was no longer king because of his perjuries, dishonest acts, barbarous murders, unjust imprisonments and terrible massacres of the faithful patrons and defenders of the Roman Catholic and Apostolic faith, and that the people were no longer obliged to obey him. On the first day of the new year, 1589, Leicester, after preaching in the church of St. Bartholomew, required all those present to swear by raising their hands in token of their consent that they would spend their last farthing and shed their last drop of blood to avenge the death of the two princes of Lorraine, murdered by the tyrant in the castle of Blois before the eyes of the Parliament. He exacted a special oath from the senior president, Harley, who sat opposite him and heard his sermon, addressing him twice with these words, "Raise your hand, Mr. President, raise it higher, higher still, please, so that the people may see it." Which he did, but in spite of this he was still exposed to scandal and danger from the people, who were given to understand that the president knew of the murder of the princes of Lorraine, whom Paris adored as its patron gods. On Saturday, January 7th, news arrived in Paris of the death of the king's mother, who died at the Château de Blois on Thursday, January 5th. The next day Leicester, preaching again in the church of St. Bartholomew, spoke thus of this woman, "She has done much good and much evil in her life, and I think that she has done more evil than good. I do not even doubt it. Now, gentlemen, a doubt will arise whether the Catholic Church should pray for her, in view of her evil life, and also the fact that she often supported heresy, although towards the end of her life she took the side of our Holy Alliance, and, as they say, did not consent to the murder of our good princes. To this I say to you, gentlemen, that if you wish, on occasion, out of mercy to read a Pater or an Ave for her, you can do so. This will be of benefit to her, perhaps, but if not, it does not matter, and I leave the matter to yourselves. Some believe that Henry III did not consult his mother about the murder of the Duke of Guise. We are inclined to believe Maiorem, the king's senior physician, who claims that everything was thought up together with her. Catherine de' Medici was given the following epitaph, which perfectly characterizes her political life. "The queen who rests here was an angel and a devil. She deserves as much praise as blame. She supported the state, she also destroyed it. She reconciled many and quarreled many. She gave birth to 3 kings and kindled 5 civil wars, built palaces and castles and destroyed cities, made many good laws and bad decrees. Wish her, passerby, hell and heaven. We will add nothing about this woman, whose genius cannot atone for her profound depravity." The 16 loudly declared that if her body were brought to Paris, they would throw it in the slaughterhouse or the Seine. Therefore, she was temporarily buried in Blois, in the Church of the Savior. Leicester was not the only priest who turned the pulpit into a tribune of fanaticism. A preacher known as the Little Felion dared to apply to Guise the words spoken by the people about Christ. "O holy and glorious martyr of God," he exclaimed, "blessed is the womb that bore you, and the paps that suckled you." Francis Pisnat, priest of St. Nicholas and brother of the Jesuit provincial, carried his fanaticism still further. During the funeral service for the Duke of Guise, which he celebrated in St. John's, he asked his listeners if there was not among them a Catholic zealous enough to avenge the death of the Christian hero on the tyrant. Then, alluding to the impending confinement of the Duchess of Guise, he recited in her name 2 verses, in imitation of Virgil. "Exoriere aliquis nostris ex ossibus alter. Cafes eulegios feroce sequer tyrannos." One can imagine the impression these preachers made on the people. Everywhere they tore up the king's portraits, threw down his statues, and smashed his coats of arms. Satirical announcements, offensive anagrams of the tyrant's name, were pasted up at all the crossroads. They spoke of him as nothing less than a heretic, as excommunicated from the church. They called him only the vile Herod, Herod's villain, an anagram of the name Henry of Valois. In order to legitimize these disorders and to calm the scruples of certain persons who looked upon them with horror, the 16 decided to appeal to the Sorbonne for a resolution of the question of conscience in the name of the merchant elders, the syndics, and the Catholics of Paris. The Sorbonne had lost its former glory. Instead of serious and learned theologians, there sat in it only, in the words of Peter de la Toile, filthy pedants, who after dinner traded in scepters and crowns. The disciples and adherents of the Jesuits predominated among them. Bellarmine was their oracle. They blindly yielded to the influence of the Jesuit authorities, who tried to conceal their intentions and their bad teaching under the venerable name of the Sorbonne, which had ceased to be itself. The small number of venerable doctors who still remained in it enjoyed no influence. The majority withdrew and were replaced by young scholars, Jesuit pupils. They were asked the following question of conscience: could the French people arm themselves and unite, collect money, and contribute to the defense of the Catholic, Apostolic Roman faith against a king who had violated the laws by convening the three estates? Some Parisian scholars and priests, among others Boucher, Prévost, Aubry, Bourguin, and Pignat, members of the Council of the 16, who edited the question, themselves contributed mainly to its solution. They maintained that the people were free from the oath of fidelity and obedience to the king, that they could freely and with a clear conscience arm and unite, collect taxes, and contribute to the defense and preservation of the Roman Catholic Church against the king and his adherents, since the king had violated the laws to the detriment of the Catholic faith and the Edict of the Holy Alliance. This resolution was proclaimed throughout France as the decree of the whole clergy. Palma Callou, a modern writer, does not hesitate to see in it the cause of all the disorders that followed, in the sense that it induced Pope Sixtus V to make use of the imaginary rights granted him by the Ultramontanes, and that it was the cause of the indignation of innumerable cities. The Leaguers scattered in the provinces followed the example of those of Paris, and daily the court, which was at Blois, received news that this or that city did not recognize the royal authority. The Diet assembled in Blois took advantage of these disturbances and asked permission to disperse. Its members quickly presented their charters, and the closing took place on January 16th. At it, the Archbishop of Bourges delivered a speech in the name of the clergy. Attributing all the disasters that had befallen France to the difference in religion, he proposed the following means against them: the restoration of elections, the destruction of orders, the preservation of ecclesiastical property, the observance of the disciplinary rules of the Council of Trent, the restoration of discipline in the universities, so that it would be possible to better supervise the education of youth. He also reported to the king that it was extremely necessary to protect the people from the oppression of the nobility and to return the judicial department to its former dignity. After the speeches of the orators of the nobility and the Third Estate, Henry spoke. He assured the deputies that he wished only the Catholic religion to be permitted in the state, and asked the representatives to use their influence in the provinces and cities to keep the people within the bounds of duty and obedience. All promised, but very few fulfilled their promise. Henry III did not understand the ferment that reigned everywhere. He was even so imprudent as to think that by concessions he could calm the revolution in Paris. When the president of the Council of the 16, de Maistre, came to him to beg the release of his arrested friends, the king complied with this request and sent the principal Leaguers to Paris, charging them with calming the people and making them promise to return. When they arrived in Paris, the bishop and his vicars hastened to release them from their oath, and these conspirators further inflamed the insurrection instead of stopping it. On the very day that the Diet of Blois was closed, the 16 resolved to get rid of the Parliament, which did not approve of their violence. Bussy Leclerc, the most active of the Leaguers, went with a detachment of armed men to the building of the Parliament, entered the main chamber with his sword in his hand, and said to the chief president, "I am ordered to arrest certain presidents and councillors on this list, who are accused of being the true adherents of Henry of Valois." And he began to read the list which he held in his hand. The court, hearing him name the eldest president and the oldest of the remaining presidents and councillors, cried out as one man, "We will all follow them," and immediately, rising from their seats, all the members of the court went in pairs from the palace to the Bastille, where Bussy Leclerc locked them up. However, several councillors who were considered more inclined to the League were released, and they formed a new parliament, at the head of which the 16 placed President Brisson, who was devoted to them. The first act of the new judges was to take a mutual oath, which many signed with their blood. The 16 then formed a council of state, under the presidency of the Duke of Aumerle, of the House of Lorraine, of 40 members from 3 orders: the clergy, the nobility, and the Third Estate. The following were members of the clergy: Brise, Bishop of Mos; Rose, Bishop of Agen, formerly the king's preacher; Villiers, Bishop of Saint-Lys; Prévost, priest of Saint-Severin; Boucher, priest of Saint-Benoît; Aubry, priest of Saint-André; Pelletier, priest of Saint-Jacques; Pignat, priest of Saint-Nicholas; and Launois, canon of Soissons. This council, Cayley relates, immediately sent out throughout France a proclamation in the name of the Catholic princes and the 3 estates about the reduction of all taxes and duties by 1/4. In this proclamation, it was promised to increase the taxes to the level that existed under King Louis XII. The hope of getting rid of taxes, and all kinds of taxes that burdened the people, contributed most to the uprising. Everywhere the number of members of the Holy Alliance increased, and people swore to avenge the murders committed in Blois, believing that by this they wanted to destroy the faith and prevent the relief of the people and the freedom of the Diet. On February 12th, the Duke of Mayenne arrived in Paris. He was given a solemn welcome and was elected president of the State Council. He reorganized this council, called it the General Council of the Union, and in its name invested himself with full royal power, under the title of General Viceroy of the King and Crown of France. However, he was to use this title only until July 15th, when a People's Council was to be held in Paris. True, it was said that there could be no viceroy if there was no leader, but this did not prevent the Duke of Mayenne from holding this position for 6 years for the benefit of the Union. Mayenne drew up rules and sent them to all the cities, for guidance in the selection of judges, and also to the judges themselves, for guidance in the application of the laws. In a few months, the new government was recognized by almost all of France, and only a small number of cities remained faithful to the king. Marshal Matignon preserved Bordeaux for him, driving out the Jesuits who worked in favor of the League. While Mayenne and his advisors were busy strengthening the Holy Alliance and robbing all who did not belong to their party in order to get money, the preachers were fanning the people's fanaticism with their sermons and supposedly religious processions. At the beginning of February 1589, the processions so often mentioned by modern writers began in Paris. Young men and girls went to the churches in large crowds with lighted wax candles, singing litanies, the 7 penitential and other psalms, hymns and prayers composed by the parish priests. After this, there were other processions of parishioners from all the parishes of Paris, of every age, sex and condition, walking through the streets and churches in pairs, most of them in shirts and barefoot, singing various prayers very devoutly with lighted wax candles in their hands. By the way, there was a procession consisting of almost 600 students, gathered from all colleges and schools. For the most part, children no older than 10 or 12 years old, who walked barefoot in shirts with candles in their hands, and very devoutly and harmoniously, sometimes out of tune, sang various psalms, entering different churches for prayer. The people were so excited and so enraged, if I may say so, by all these beautiful devotions that they often jumped out of bed at night and ran to their parish priests to have them lead them in procession through the churches. For example, some of the parishioners of the Church of Saint Eustache came to their priest at night and forced him to get out of bed, demanding that he lead them for a walk. When the priest tried to object to them, they called him a politician and a heretic, and forced him to fulfill their desire. In fact, only this good priest and 2 or 3 others in Paris, but no more, did not approve of these night processions because, frankly speaking, everything in them was indecent. Both men and women, boys and girls, all walked mixed up together, naked in their shirts. The Chevalier d'Aumale did not miss any of these nocturnal processions, not because he was driven by piety, but for a completely different reason. During these processions, various obscenities were committed, which were a lure for the majority. Even the clergymen made scandals, but the people found food for their fanaticism in the prayers they were forced to pronounce. In April, the Jesuit Sorbonne decided that the name of Henry of Valois would be removed from all prayers, and composed new prayers in which Catholic princes replaced the king. When the processions entered the churches, the preachers, instead of reading the gospel, vomited streams of abuse and infamy against the king, so that the people never left the church except with their heads flushed and ready to rush at the politicians. When Rome learned of Henry III agreement with the King of Navarre, Pope Sixtus V sent him an order to appear in Rome to give an account of the murder of Cardinal Guise and the imprisonment of Cardinal Bourbon. In case of disobedience, the Pope declared the king excommunicated. Meanwhile, Henry of Navarre, after a meeting with the king at the castle of Plessis-les-Tours, went to war. He began to press hard on the Leaguers, won several victories over them, and soon found himself under the walls of Paris. Henry III moved to St. Cloud, where he received news that the Swiss were coming to his aid. The League was in great danger, and its fanaticism was further inflamed by this. It has already doubled since the king's agreement with Henry of Navarre. We give the floor to Estienne de la Toile to describe all the ferocity and brutality of fanaticism. When the Parisians and the Leaguers learned of the agreement and alliance of the two kings, they proclaimed throughout France, and especially in Paris, by means of their usual heralds, and Madame de Montespan by means of priests specially hired and paid for this purpose, that the mask had been torn off, that the tyrant had exposed his hypocrisy, having clearly shown himself to be the author and supporter of heresy, by receiving a heretic and entering into an alliance with him, from which it followed without any doubt that in this war it was only a question of the Catholic religion, which they wanted to extirpate and drive out of France, and therefore, more than ever, it was necessary, for the maintenance and defense of the true faith, to spare neither property nor life. Such was the gospel of that time. No other was preached in Paris, and it was heard more willingly than the true gospel of peace. From the pulpits only abuse was heard, mainly directed at the king. He was called a dog, a tiger, a heretic, a tyrant, with all there might arousing disgust and hatred towards him in the people, not allowing him to be called anything other than offensive words. There was no such miserable preacher who would not insert into his speech a whole series of insults to the king. There was no such pedantic ignoramus who would not compose couplets about him. There was no such poor shabby typesetter who would not manage daily to print either some stupid speech or an offensive libel on the king, filled with the most terrible curses. Boucher, a priest of Saint Benoit and a pupil of the Jesuits, distinguished himself among the pamphleteers by his book on the true abdication of Henry III. In it he asserted that the king, having entered into an alliance with heretics excommunicated from the church, had thereby become excommunicated himself, and that therefore the French were released from their oath of allegiance to the king. The book was not yet ready for publication when Henry III was assassinated, and Boucher took advantage of this circumstance and supplemented his book with a justification of this crime. When the royal army approached Paris, the fury of the Leaguers flared up even more. In Paris, says Estienne de la Toile, it became dangerous to laugh on any occasion, for anyone who looked even slightly cheerful was taken for a politician or a royalist, and they were in danger, because the priests and preachers warned against them and thought that anyone who laughed and rejoiced should be arrested. Some women were about to be thrown into prison for wearing their best clothes on weekdays, and a respectable house was almost destroyed because a servant said that she had seen her masters laughing that day. Ultramontanism has always been as ridiculous as it has been intolerant and cruel. The royal army soon occupied St. Cloud, Madden, Issy, Vaugirard, Vannes, and the surrounding villages. The king settled in St. Cloud, from where he could see all of Paris, which the king considered the heart of the League, and said that in order to destroy it, it was necessary to strike it at its very heart. The Parisians knew the attitude of Henry III. Towards them, they knew that, looking from his windows upon Paris, he said, "It would be a great pity to destroy and lose so good and beautiful a city. But it is necessary to curb these rebels who have so shamefully driven me from my city." They even knew that he had boasted on Sunday, the 30th of July, that he would enter Paris on Tuesday or Wednesday of the following week, and therefore they thought it opportune to take their precautions. They seized about 300 of the most distinguished and influential citizens, whom they called politicians and Huguenots, and put them in the various prisons of the city. If we are to believe serious writers, these prisoners were hostages for a young fanatic whom Madame Montpensier had persuaded to go to St. Cloud and assassinate the king. She assured him that, in case of his arrest, these hostages would guarantee his life. The Leaguers say otherwise. They deny that the prisoners were hostages. Be that as it may, on August 1st, a young Dominican, Jacques Clement, entered the king's room at 8 o'clock in the morning and stabbed him in the lower abdomen. Feeling himself wounded, the king himself pulled out the knife left there by the villain and stabbed the murderer above the eye. Several nobles ran into the room, seized Clement, killed him, and threw him out of the window. At first, the surgeons did not consider the wound dangerous, and so the king immediately sent the following letter to the governors of the provinces and to the foreign courts. This morning a young Jacobin, brought by my attorney general, that, as he said, he might deliver to me letters from M. Harley, the senior president of my court in Parliament, my good and faithful servant, who was imprisoned for this occasion, and also to give me something from him, was by my order brought into my room, where only M. Bellegarde, my chamberlain, and the said attorney general were present. The young man, having bowed to me, pretended to have something to say to me. Then I ordered the two gentlemen to retire, when suddenly he struck me with a knife, thinking to kill me. But God, who preserves his own, did not wish me to lose my life, because of my respect for those who wear the garments of the servants of God, and he in his mercy preserved me, and did not allow the evil design to be accomplished. The knife slipped, so that, if it be the will of God, I shall die. I hope to be healthy again in a few days. Such were the hopes of the king. When he received his wound, he immediately called his chaplain, who set up an altar in his room and celebrated Mass. During the offering of the gifts, the king said loudly and with tears, "Lord God, if you find that my life is useful and needed by my people and state, which you have entrusted to me, then preserve me and prolong my days. If not, my God, take my body and my soul into your kingdom. Thy will be done." Then he uttered the beautiful words that the Church sings on such occasions, O salutaris hostia. The rest of the day the king spent in conversation about God with Louis de Parade, his almoner, and with many princes and nobles, who did not leave him until the end. When he called to him Stephen Bologna, his confessor, to confess and receive absolution, the priest said, "Sire, it is rumored that His Holiness has sent you a pastoral exhortation regarding what recently happened at Blois. Although I do not know what this exhortation consists of, I cannot, without violating my duty, refrain from begging you to fulfill the desire of His Holiness, otherwise I will not be able to absolve you of your sins." The king answered loudly, in the presence of all the princes and nobles, "I am the first son of the Roman Catholic Church, and I wish to die as such. I swear to you by God that I am always and now ready to fulfill everything that His Holiness requires of me." After these words, Bologna absolved him of his sins. Soon after, Henry of Navarre arrived, who, at the first news of the attempt on the king, hastened to take all necessary measures in case of a sortie of the Leaguers. The king was already much worse from his wound. "My brother," he said to Navarre, "you see in what position I am. If God is pleased to call me to himself, I will die with joy, seeing you here. Such is the will of God concerning this state, which I leave you in great anxiety. The crown belongs to you, after the Lord calls me back. I pray him that you will have to reign in peace. I have ordered all the king's servants to recognize you as king after my death." Henry of Navarre did not answer a word, but knelt down and kissed his hand with tears. By 2 o'clock in the morning the patient's condition had deteriorated so much that there was no hope left. The king himself ordered his chaplain to bring the holy gifts, so that he could confess and receive communion once more. Then he said, In manus tuas Domini, and began to read the psalm Miserere me Deus, but was unable to finish. Having begun confession again, he began to speak very quietly. Bologna gave him absolution. Soon he was completely speechless and gave up his soul to God, crossing himself twice. It is a pity that during his life Henry III was not such a Christian as he was at the moment of his death. On the very day of his death, the execution of Jacques Clement's body was carried out. The murderer was torn to pieces by 4 horses, then burned and the ashes thrown into the Seine. The Leaguers elevated Jacques Clement to the status of a hero and placed him alongside those ascetics who are glorified in the sacred books for their courage and their devotion to their homeland. Pope Sixtus V dared to compare him with Judith and Eleazar. The Jesuit Mariana, in his work The King, called him the eternal glory of France. The Jesuit Comelet, abbot of the monastery of the Professors in Paris, surpassed Boucher and Leicester in his sermons. He extolled the deed of Jacques Clement and demanded a new AUD to kill the heretic king, that is, Henry IV. One day, in a fit of rage, he exclaimed, "We need AD, we need AD, be he a warrior or a monk, a groom or a shepherd, it is all the same, but we need AD, that is all that is lacking to make our affairs stand as we wish." Chapter 2. 1589 to 1594. Henry III was assassinated on the 1st of August, 1589. On the morning of the 2nd, the news reached Paris. The people showed their joy in an indecent manner, and Madame de Montpensier, in a daring rage and with mad impudence, distributed green sashes to the conspirators. She threw her arms around the neck of the man who brought her the news, and said, "Ah, my friend, you are welcome, but is it at least true? Is this wretch, this hypocrite, this tyrant dead? God, how glad I am! I regret only one thing, that when he died he did not know that I was the cause of his death." Then, turning to her ladies-in-waiting, she added, "What do you think? Is my head better supported now? It seems to me that it no longer shakes as before." She went at once to Madame Nemours, her mother, and with her walked the principal streets and squares of Paris. "Good news, friends," cried both these women to everyone they met. "Good news, the tyrant is dead. There is no more Henry of Valois in France." Arriving at the monastery of the Franciscan monks, Madame Nemours climbed the steps of the high altar, and from there addressed this stupid people with a speech about the death of the tyrant. They ordered that mock fires be lit everywhere, expressing their great joy with words, gestures, indecent disguises, and revelry. Anyone who did not laugh and maintain the slightest sadness was considered a politician and a heretic. Theologians and preachers, for their part, never ceased to tell the people that the good monk who paid with his life for ridding France of that dog of Henry of Valois was a true martyr, and they dared to compare his deed with the greatest mysteries of the incarnation and resurrection of Jesus Christ. When the enthusiasm had somewhat cooled, they began to get down to serious business. The Duke of Mayenne did not dare to proclaim himself king, but on August 5th he published an edict in favor of the Holy Alliance and the old Cardinal Bourbon, proposing him to be king. In this edict he promised to convene a diet in the shortest possible time to legitimize this choice. The cardinal, a real theatrical king, was in prison at Tours, and therefore Mayenne continued to call himself the viceroy of the state and crown of France. They said, notes Pierre de la Toile, that he thought more of himself than of the cardinal. On the eve of the publication of the Edict of Mayenne, Henry of Navarre made a speech to the princes and nobles who were with him at St. Cloud on his rights to the French throne. Henry was in a most difficult position. Not to mention his religion, which was the greatest obstacle to his plans, he had against him the greater part of the French, the princes of his own house, and powerful foreign rulers, such as the Pope, the King of Spain, and the whole Austrian royal house. He had no money and almost no army. In spite of all this, says Pierre de la Toile, he conquered his kingdom inch by inch and gained victories everywhere. In his speech he promised to grant freedom of conscience and to return to the bosom of the Roman Catholic Church when he had become sufficiently acquainted with its doctrine. This powerful and pathetic speech carried away the majority of the princes and officers of the army, who recognized him as king on condition that he kept his word and studied Catholicism. However, many, under the pretext of putting their provinces or their affairs in order, asked to be released and left the army. Henry IV, having neither money nor ammunition, and with a weakened army, could not continue the siege of Paris and moved to Normandy. Mayenne followed him. The two armies met at Arques. Mayenne was defeated. The victorious Henry pursued him to Paris itself and took possession of the city suburbs south of the Seine, but did not dare to cross the river. He limited himself to leaving a small army in these suburbs to harass the city, and went to Tours, the main city of the province. Sixtus V followed the phases of this struggle with anxiety. The agents of the League in Rome had so taken possession of his mind that at first he would not listen to the Duke of Luxembourg, who had come to him as a deputy of the Catholic nobles, supporters of Henry IV. The Duke of Luxembourg was to describe to the Pope the miserable situation of France, which asked His Holiness for help, but in such a way as to unite all the French, but not to separate them. By fulfilling this request, the Pope would not only heal the French monarchy, but would also ensure the tranquility of the whole Christian world, which could not help but suffer from the great upheavals experienced by its first and principal member. On his arrival in Italy, Luxembourg was surprised by the excellent reception given there to the commander of Dieu and the agents of the Duke of Mayenne and the League. Sixtus V refused to receive him at all, and even forbade him entry into the Papal States. The Pope, on the basis of reports from the League's agents, believed that Henry was in a desperate situation, that he was back to the sea, and that he had to either fall into the hands of Mayenne or jump into the sea and leave French soil. Impressed by these reports, the Pope sent Legate Cajetan to France. This legate was the brother of the Duke of Sermoneta, an Italian, but a subject of the King of Spain. This choice showed the bad attitude of Sixtus V towards Henry IV. The latter pretended not to believe at first in the evil intentions of the papal envoy. Having learned of his departure, Henry ordered all the cities subject to him to receive the papal legate with honors if he passed through them, and all the governors of the province ordered to give him the necessary guard if he went to him, Henry. But at the same time he declared that he would consider him his enemy if the legate joined the leaders of the League in Paris or elsewhere and did not recognize any of his actions as correct. Cajetan was appointed legate on October 2nd and set out immediately, accompanied by several scholars, including the Jesuits Bellarmine and the preacher Pernigorol. He arrived in Lyons on November 9th, and clearly understood then that this journey would not bring him the glory and success that the Pope desired and that he himself hoped for. In Lyons he learned that Henry had won a brilliant victory at Arques, and that he was continuing to conquer Normandy, while the affairs of the Union were in very bad shape. Several parties were formed within the League itself. The Duke of Lorraine was anxious to place his son on the throne of France. Mayenne dreamed of the same for himself. The King of Spain, dreaming of a universal monarchy, thought that with the help of the Pope and the Jesuits he would himself become King of France. While these ambitious rivals were quarreling among themselves and weakening the League, prudent men were striking at it in Paris itself, its heart. Many learned men, both secular and ecclesiastical, by their exhortations induced many respectable and noble Parisians to remember their duty and courageously set about restoring order and obedience to the king. Politicians like Villeroy and Janin, in spite of all their devotion to Mayenne, understood the danger of the League and dealt it a fatal blow by assuming the role of mediator between it and Henry. The legate stayed for some time at Lyons, awaiting further orders from the Pope. Having learned what had happened from his envoy and from Luxembourg, whom he had finally agreed to receive, the Pope, says de la Toile, saw that the members of the Union had not told him everything, and forbade Cardinal Cajetan to excommunicate the princes and nobles who belonged to the royal party. Mayenne, knowing that the legate was going to France to influence the choice of the king, and that he was devoted to the Spanish party, hastened to declare Cardinal Bourbon king, with the help of the Parisian Parliament, and to confirm for himself the title of Viceroy until the complete and perfect liberation of His Majesty. Mendoza, the Spanish envoy, did not lose courage. Having entered into a secret agreement with the 16, whom he managed to win over to his side, he proposed to name Philip the second patron of the French kingdom, in gratitude for which the Spanish king would render France great services both in secular and spiritual affairs. He even, by agreement with the 16, published several articles that were praised by preachers and Jesuits. Here are some of them. The Spanish king has so many states that he does not need France. He will be content with the title of patron of the French kingdom with certain conditions. His Majesty will be called the patron of the French kingdom. The king will remain Monseigneur Cardinal Bourbon, whom, with God's help, His Majesty will release from prison and order to be crowned at Reims. There may be a marriage between one of his family and a French prince, who, on the death of the said Lord Cardinal, shall be crowned King of France. On the occasion of the marriage, His Majesty gives up Flanders and Burgundy to be annexed to France. No Spaniard will be admitted to any spiritual benefices in France, nor to judicial positions, nor to the management of border towns. In other articles the Spanish king undertakes to continue the war, to pay off the public debts by taxes which shall be levied for that purpose alone, and to grant the French the right of free trade in their American possessions. Villeroy succeeded in persuading the Duke of Mayenne to abandon these proposals as much for his own benefit as for the good of France. Odin Pisnat, the provincial of the Jesuits, immediately set about harming Villeroy in the opinion of the Duke of Mayenne. He went to him and said many things about this statesman. The Duke replied, "My father, I do not believe this, I trust him." Astonished by this answer, the Jesuit left empty-handed. Meanwhile the legate had arrived at Paris. On Friday, the 15th of January, 1590, he made his appearance in great state at the Parliament, accompanied by a crowd of Leaguers. Entering the hall, he went towards the canopy prepared for the king on solemn occasions, but the senior president stopped him, and taking him by the hand, as if wishing to do him honor, seated him on a bench lower than himself. The legate, who flattered himself that he would occupy, as a representative, the place of the head of the state, concealed his displeasure, and made a long speech in Latin on the power and majesty of the Pope, on his love for France, and on the zeal which he expected from the French in the preservation of the Roman Catholic Apostolic faith. On February 5th of the same year, the bull of Sixtus V on the powers of the legate was adopted by Parliament. On the 10th of the same month, a solemn meeting of all the members of the theological faculty was held at the Sorbonne to ratify the Holy Alliance. The legate was present. he was shown the formula of the oath, which he approved, as leading directly to the extermination of heretics and the exclusion forever of the King of Navarre, whether he be a Catholic or not. All those present at the meeting read the formula of this oath and swore on the gospel to observe it. The minutes of this solemnity were drawn up with great ceremony and printed with the permission of the secular power and the legate. Mayenne hastened to hint to the legate that the Pope alone should be declared the protector of the Catholic faith in France, and that for this reason the Duke would not consent to the protectorate of the King of Spain. The legate and some other clergy found this reason valid, and so Mendoza's intrigue finally failed. Delighted by this approval, Mayenne carried out a coup d'état in order to get rid of the Council of the Union and the 16, who almost all belonged to the Union. He declared that this council was unnecessary, since there was a king, whose representative he, the Duke, was. Therefore, he dissolved the council in the name of Charles X and appointed 4 secretaries of state, who had been in charge of all affairs by decree of the king during the time of Monseigneur the Duke of Mayenne as Viceroy of the State and Crown of France. D'Epinac, Archbishop of Lyons, was appointed Keeper of the Seal, that is, Minister of Justice of the new government. Having indirectly invested himself with all the king's powers, Mayenne convened a popular council for February 3, 1590. Having finished these affairs, Mayenne advanced with his army to Ivry, where he was defeated by Henry IV. After this defeat, he understood that the Spaniards would not save him, and that it would be best for him to renew his secret negotiations, through the mediation of Villeroy. The Jesuits were very much against this. They were too close to the Spanish king to give up their policy so easily. The supporters of the Spanish party gathered with them for secret meetings and, together with the Jesuits, devised all sorts of intrigues in order to support their party and achieve their goal. The pretended King Charles X was dying. They could not count on Mayenne, since they knew of his negotiations. In this extremity they conspired with the legate and the Spanish envoy, and proposed to their Sorbonne the following 3 questions. 1. If Charles X dies or transfers his rights to Henry of Bourbon, are the French obliged, and can they recognize him as king, even if the spiritual interdict imposed on him is lifted? Is he not a heretic, or a perpetrator of heresy, who, having the power to prevent reconciliation with Henry, desires or promises this reconciliation? Is resistance to this Henry worthy of praise, and can anyone who perished in the struggle against him be considered a martyr? The second question was obviously directed against the Duke of Mayenne. The Jesuits were going to declare the head of the League a heretic. The Sorbonne answered these 3 questions on May 7th, the day before the death of the Cardinal King. Its unanimous resolution deserves attention. By divine right, Catholics are forbidden to recognize as their king a heretic or a perpetrator of heresy and a known enemy of the Church, and especially one who has returned to heresy and has been excommunicated by the Pope. If it should happen that such a person would receive absolution for his crimes and the lifting of the prohibitions imposed on him, but despite this, would be suspected of deceit and treachery and dangerous to the Catholic faith, then, on the basis of the same divine right, this person is subject to deprivation of the royal dignity. Anyone who tries to elevate him to the royal throne, or helps and patronizes him, or even does not hinder him in his intention, despite the fact that he has the opportunity to do so, and is obliged to do so by his position, violates the holy canons, and he can justly be suspected of heresy and considered harmful to the faith and the Church, and therefore, one can and should treat him without any respect for his rank and position. From this it follows that, since Henry of Bourbon is a heretic, a promoter of heresy, a notorious enemy of the Church, who has returned to heresy and has been excommunicated by our most holy Father the Pope, and since the Catholic faith is in obvious danger from him of deceit, dissimulation, and perfidy if he should succeed in obtaining from somewhere a sanction for his crimes, the French are bound by conscience to use every possible means to prevent him from ascending the most Christian throne, and in no way to reconcile themselves to him, despite the aforementioned lifting of the ban, even if any other legitimate heir to the throne were to die or renounce his rights. Anyone who will assist him will violate the canons, will be suspected of heresy, will be considered harmful to the Church, and as such, will be subject to severe punishment and punishment. Just as those who in any way render aid or service to the said Henry, who claims the throne, are apostates from the faith and remain forever in mortal sin, so those who resist him in every way, driven by religious zeal, have great merits before God and men, and just as the former, who stubbornly build the kingdom of Satan, are prepared for eternal torment, so the latter awaits the kingdom of heaven, if they endure to the end, and in defense of the faith receive the crown of martyrdom. This decree was immediately printed, published, and sent everywhere, together with a letter from the citizens of Paris to all the Catholics of the cities that were part of the Holy Alliance. The Parisians called upon them to follow their own example, and to suffer sword, fire, hunger, and every extreme, but not to submit to a heretic sovereign and instigator of heresy. The decision of the Sorbonne and the letter of the Parisians were as hostile to Mayenne as to Henry. The Spanish party, supported by the Jesuits, the Capuchins, and the 16, was gaining the upper hand over the Guises, whose popularity was falling every day. Mayenne, however, pretended to approve of the decision of the Sorbonne. Now, he said, the Spanish king will certainly help us. The Parisians will have to fight Henry of Navarre to the last extremity, and the allied cities, in which the Third Estate predominates and which did not want to submit to my authority, will be forced to come to our aid. But he was only outwardly pleased. Secretly, he sympathized with Villeroy, Cardinal Gondi, and the Archbishop of Lyon, who were working for reconciliation with the king. The decree of the Sorbonne had a strong effect on the people, who began to suffer and murmur. The legate and the Spanish envoy distributed generous alms, and all silver objects, except those absolutely necessary for the service, were taken from the churches to pay the salaries of the soldiers of the League. At last, to support the people's enthusiasm, the monks had the strange idea of organizing a procession of an entirely new kind. They invited some priests and students to go with them, armed themselves, and went to the Augustinians. Rose, Bishop of Senlis, walked at the head as commander, and behind him came the clergy for abreast, then the prior and the Carthusian monks, then the 4 orders of mendicants, the Capuchins, the Minims, among whom were visible rows of school children. The superiors of all these orders held a crucifix in one hand and a halberd in the other. Others had harquebuses, halberds, daggers, and other weapons borrowed from their neighbors. All were in their cassocks, with the skirts up and the hoods thrown back over their shoulders. Many wore helmets, breastplates, and armor. Hamilton, a Scotchman by birth, and the priest of St. Cosmas, acted as sergeant and formed the monks into ranks. Sometimes he stopped them to sing hymns, and sometimes he made them fire their muskets. The people flocked to see this new spectacle, which, according to the believers, represented the militant church. The legate also appeared, and by his presence, as it were, sanctified so extraordinary and so ridiculous a spectacle. But it happened that one of these new soldiers, doubtless unaware that his arquebus was loaded with a bullet, took it into his head to salute the legate, who was riding in a carriage with Panigarol, the Jesuit Bellarmine, and other Italians, and shot and killed one of these monks, the legate's almsgiver. As a result, the legate hastened to return home, and the people loudly cried out that this monk was very fortunate to have been killed in such a holy setting. The Jesuits did not appear in this procession. They never mixed in public ceremonies with other monastic orders, most of whom they treated with the greatest contempt, and although they often conducted for others certain ceremonies, not so much religious as superstitious, yet in their own monasteries they always showed great indifference to everything pertaining to popular beliefs, and even to divine service. It is therefore not surprising that they did not take part in the procession of the League. Their friends and supporters conducted it for them. Despite all efforts to kindle popular fanaticism, the excitement did not last long, due to hunger, which made itself felt in a terrible way. Ordinary handouts were no longer enough. It was impossible to obtain the most essential supplies for money. On June 15, 1590, Mendoza, the Spanish envoy, at a council assembled to find ways of feeding the people, made a strange and never-before-heard proposal, namely, to send to the mill and grind into flour the bones of the dead buried in the Church of the Innocents, in Paris, so that, having moistened this flour with water, bread could be baked from it for those who had neither grain nor the means of obtaining it. Shamelessness and fanaticism could not go further. Could not the Jesuits inspire a little more humanity in the representative of their King Philip II, in whom they had such confidence? On the 20th of June the whole stock of wheat was exhausted, and the inhabitants were forced to live on a porridge of bran. On the 24th, the Archbishop of Lyons and the Spanish envoy, passing by the palace, saw a considerable crowd of people complaining of hunger, and ordered that money be thrown to them. "We do not need money but bread," cried the unfortunates. The Archbishop of Lyons was touched by these complaints and rushed to the police, saying that it was necessary to take immediate care to satisfy the needs of the population. At once, with the sound of a trumpet, it was announced that all the parish priests and elders, All the abbots of monasteries and communities should assemble at the palace the following day. They came, and were required to take part in alleviating the people's distress with money or bread. Some wanted to object to this and asked for a delay, but the Duke of Nemours, the governor of the city, declared that the emergency compelled some decision to be taken immediately. It was ordered to inspect all spiritual monasteries, both white and black clergy. The audit began the following day, the 26th. The rector of the Jesuit college, Therius, accompanied by Father Bellarmine, came to the legate with a request to exempt his monastery from the audit. The merchant elder, who was present, answered loudly for all to hear, "Mr. Rector, your request is impolite and indecent for a Christian. Didn't everyone who had wheat have to sell it to satisfy the general need? Why should you be an exception? Is your life more precious than ours?" The rector was completely confused by this answer. The Jesuit monastery was searched along with the others. They found in it a great deal of wheat and a whole year's supply of biscuits, a great deal of salted meat, vegetables, hay and other provisions in greater quantities than in the 4 best monasteries in Paris. The Capuchins had biscuits in abundance. Finally, in all the houses of the clergy there was found a quantity of various provisions exceeding the 6-month requirement. At the time when the mendicant monasticism was so well provided for, the people lived on the flesh of cats, dogs, donkeys, and mules. At the crossroads and corners of the streets, says Pierre de la Toile, there were cauldrons with this disgusting food and with a stew of oats, and the people fought among themselves for it. The majority got nothing, and people were forced to hunt dogs and eat raw grass. The small amount of provisions that was brought into the city was bought at fabulous prices. It happened that the rich could not get anything even for money. Only the sermons were cheap. They fed the poor people with air, that is, with fables and lies, assuring them that it would please God more if the people died of hunger, if they even killed their children for lack of food for them, than if they accepted and recognized a heretic as king. This is the gospel that was read at that time in Paris from the notes of Madame Montespan, which she sent daily to the preachers, instead of the gospel for that day. These are the words of Pierre de la Toile. These disgusting instructions did not remain in vain. Some people killed their children and salted their bodies for future use in order to eat them. By the end of July there was absolutely nothing edible left in the city. Everything had been eaten, even the flour from human bones and from slate stones. Mendoza's project was carried out. The citizens demanded surrender. Crowds of poor people scattered throughout the suburbs, but the troops of Henry IV forced them to return to the city again. Only 3,000 were allowed to leave Paris. They tried to cheer the people with the hope of help from the Netherlands. Mayen, who stopped at Meaux on his way back, often spoke of this, but his promises were so often unfulfilled that they ceased to be believed. On August 2nd, the Duke of Nemours convened a general council, at which, after many meetings and discussions, it was decided, in order to calm the people, that Cardinal Gondi and the Archbishop of Lyons should go to Henry and Mayen to discuss the measures necessary to pacify the state. But since the Jesuit Sorbonne had cursed without mercy anyone who would bother to reach an agreement with Henry, both deputies turned to the legate with a request to cancel this decision of the Sorbonne. The legate invited several prelates and theologians to him, and proposed the following question to them. Since the city of Paris is in such extremity that it is forced to surrender on certain conditions to the heretic king, are not those clergymen who go to this king with the purpose of converting him, or at least to negotiate the best conditions for the Catholic religion, subject to the consequences set forth in the bull of His Holiness of September 5, 1585? The assembly gave the legate the following answer. In the year of our Lord 1590, on the 3rd day of August, the above question was proposed to the true theologians by the most illustrious Henry, Cardinal Cajetan, legate in France. We, the undersigned, having assembled in the palace, having carefully considered and discussed the matter, have answered in the negative. The spiritual men who, in the aforementioned extremity and for the aforementioned reason, shall go to the heretic king, shall not be subject to the consequences indicated in the aforementioned bull. Signed, Brother Francis, Bishop of Asti, Robert Bellarmine, Felix Vincent, James Therius. These theologians belong to the Jesuit order, except the Bishop of Asti. For them the contradictions did not matter, as we have already said. Having secured this permission, Gondi and Diepenac left Paris to carry out the mission entrusted to them. They saw Henry and Mayen, and obtained a truce. Those who sent them had only in view the gaining of time, since they knew of the approach of the Spaniards. The often promised aid finally arrived, and interrupted the negotiations for a time. The Duke of Parma, at the head of the Spanish army, was approaching Paris. Henry, who had been letting out of the city all who wished to take refuge elsewhere for the last few days, raised the siege, collected his army, and advanced to meet the Duke of Parma in order to fight him, but the latter declined the battle. The two armies remained facing each other for 7 days. Meanwhile, Henry sent a detachment to seize the faubourg of St. James, but the Jesuits, who had a college in that quarter, were guarding the walls, gave the alarm, and killed 3 royalists who had already scaled the wall. Henry, unable to carry on a prolonged campaign with an army which he could not pay, divided his troops into detachments and sent them to various places, to Touraine, Normandy, Champagne, Bourgogne, and some fortified places near Paris. Mayenne, finding no enemies on his way, entered Paris with the Spaniards. The Parisians did not show any particular joy and looked at each other with sadness rather than joy, still suffering from hunger and thinking more about the torments they had experienced than about a happy future. A few days before Mayenne entered Paris, news arrived of the death of Sixtus V, who died on August 28th. Before his death, this pope had changed his view of the affairs of France. The Battle of Ivry had especially opened his eyes. Having received news of it, the pope called Luxembourg and asked him with curiosity about the king's character. The ambassador took advantage of the opportunity and spoke passionately of Henry's magnanimity, mercy, and love of humanity. The pope listened for a long time and finally said, "If he is such, I repent of having excommunicated him. However, he was already excommunicated when I issued my bull." Luxembourg brought with him to Rome Hugues de Lestre, a man who had a very good command of Latin and was well versed in state affairs. Having once heard him speak on French affairs, Sixtus was so pleased with it that he wished to hear him again, but in full consistory. Olivares, the Spanish ambassador at the Roman court, the agents of the League, and especially Cardinal Pelve, opposed this solemn audience with all their might, but Sixtus had an iron will, and they were forced to listen to Hugues de Lestre's speech. Many cardinals, who had been deceived by the Leaguers until then, openly changed their minds, and the Pope himself replied to the cardinals of Vendôme and Lenoncourt, who belonged to Henry's party, and wrote to the Pope on French affairs. Then the Spanish ambassador became so irritated that he told the Pope that if the Pope, for the good of the Catholic faith, did not expel Luxembourg from Rome, the king, his master, would declare war on the Pope and deprive him of the papal throne, by calling a council in his dominions. After this outburst, Olivares left Rome and was replaced by the Duke of Cesse, who came expressly to prevent the reception of Henry IV into the bosom of the Church and to force the expulsion of Luxembourg from Rome. In addition, he demanded from the Pope financial assistance for the League and the excommunication of all Catholic royalists. Sixtus refused. Several bishops were chosen as judges in this dispute, but the Pope died. We will return to some of the circumstances of his death and to his attitude towards the Jesuits. Luxembourg returned to France, having written several letters to the conclave, which were not even accepted. The agents of the League in Rome informed their friends in Paris of the views of Sixtus V, and sent them all the libels against the Pope which they themselves had composed and circulated. As soon as Paris learned of the Pope's death, Christopher Aubry, the priest of St. Andrew's, dared to proclaim from the pulpit that this death was a great blessing and a miracle. "God," he exclaimed, "has delivered us from a bad pope and a politician. If he had lived longer, it would have been necessary to preach sermons against the Pope to the amazement of all. This would have been necessary." It is worth noting this confession. The Jesuits and Ultramontanes always praised only those popes who listened to their whispers. The rest they secretly persecuted, tied up in business, and slandered. We will cite facts to confirm these words. Legate Cajetan took advantage of the death of Sixtus V and left France. He went to Corbeil to pay his respects to the Dukes of Mayenne and Parma, and warned them that he had to go to Rome to elect a new pope. But in reality, he wanted to get rid of the labors that had befallen him since his arrival in France, where he had achieved nothing and where he had had so little luck. When Paris was closely besieged by the royal troops, Cajetan obtained a pass for an interview with Pisani, who had recently arrived from Rome. It was then said that Cajetan had gone to negotiate a truce, but more informed people assured him that his only object was to learn what was happening in Rome. The change in the Pope's policy towards France undoubtedly worried him greatly. Cajetan was so afraid of the royalists that a small army had to be detached to accompany him to the Swiss frontier. He left Philippe Séguin, Bishop of Plaisance, in France as vice-legate. But the Ligurian Parliament and the 16 did not want to recognize him as vice-legate on the grounds that the Pope was dead and Cajetan had no right to appoint a deputy. Therefore, for the time being, Sega received the title of agent of the Roman court. Cajetan learned that Urban VII had been elected Pope. On his arrival in Rome he found him dead, and Gregory XIV on the throne of St. Peter. It is said that Urban VII had promised the agents of the League to take their side, and to place at their disposal all the treasures collected by his predecessor in the castle of St. Angelo. Gregory XIV, who had long ago proved his loyalty to the League, promised to give it money every month. Therefore, in Paris, Thanksgiving services were held to God for the election of Gregory XIV and for his promises. The Duke of Parma then left France. Henry, who had pursued him to the frontiers of Flanders, returned to Paris. He surrounded the city and attempted to capture it by disguising his soldiers as peasants and loading them with sacks of flour. The ruse failed, and the Leaguers instituted an annual celebration of Flour Day in memory of the special favor of Providence in delivering them from the enemy. The discord between the party of the 16, the Spaniards and the Jesuits, and the party of Mayenne grew daily more intense, especially since the Duke refused to restore the Council of the League and to comply with certain demands set forth in notes given to him by the priest Boucher in the name of the 16. This priest was the chief spokesman of the Spanish party, and Rose, Bishop of Senlis, was the same for the party of Mayenne. On March 17, 1591, while preaching in the Church of Our Lady, Rose dared to say, "We need a king, otherwise we will do nothing worthwhile. We must ask God for one, not a heretic or a Burnian, we must beware of such, not a foreigner or a Spaniard, but a good Catholic of French blood. We do not need anyone else." On this canvas, other preachers embroidered a whole post. This theme was prescribed to them by notes of Madame Montespan. Boucher, fully worthy of his name 27, invited his listeners to kill all politicians. On March 13th, he was more inhuman than ever. "Several times," he said, "I have called upon you to kill and destroy the Béarnais, but you do not listen to me. You may bitterly repent of this. It is high time to take up the cleaver and the knife. There is a great need for this." Boucher was a pupil and confidant of the Jesuits. Although all his sermons in general called for murder, says de la Toile, this sermon surpassed all the others in cruelty and bloodthirstiness. He even called for the murder of judges, shouting that they were no good, urging the people with words and gestures to rush at them and get rid of them. He also said that he would like to kill and strangle this Béarn dog with his own hands, and that this would be the most pleasing sacrifice to God. On Sunday, March 24th, the Parisian preacher's notes announced that they had received information that the Béarnais was inclined to embrace the Catholic faith. In consequence of this news, all the sermons preached that day tended to refuse to receive this excommunicated man into the bosom of the Catholic Church, no matter how willing he might be, and the whole result of the teachings of that day amounted to a mass of insults addressed to the king. The priest of the Church of St. Andrew, Christopher Aubry, called him a son and a bastard. Boucher called him the red dragon spoken of in the Apocalypse, and his aged mother an old she-wolf. Lucan declared that he knew from reliable sources that many people from the city of Tours, and especially from among the members of Parliament, were strongly urging the king to embrace Catholicism, pointing out this as the only means of ruining the League. He asserted that one of the Béarnais' favorites had said the following the week before: "Let the king pretend to be a Catholic for 6 months, and he will see that in 6 months the whole rabble of the League will be destroyed and exterminated." The Jesuit Comelet said that only heretics and politicians wanted Henry to go to Mass, and that in the presence of good Catholics they called him only the King of Navarre, and when they were among themselves they called him simply the King. Both designations were nothing more than a sign of politicians, since it was impossible to call him the King of Navarre, since the King of Spain had seized his dominions. 28 As for France, Henry owned only a few swamps and marshes in La Beaucie. The preacher called him a dog, a heretic, a tyrant, and a scoundrel, and urged the people not to call him anything else. Rose, Bishop of Senlis, declared that day that he knew for certain that at the court of the Burnian there was nothing but talk about the king's conversion to Catholicism, and that his courtiers, mocking the Parisians, loudly declared that this mass would cost them dearly. Master Cayley, priest of the Church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, called the king a stinking goat, saying that he had decided to return to Catholicism too late, and he gave no reason for this except abuse, since there was no brain in the head of this priest. 29. Chavignac, the priest of the Church of Saint Sulpice, alone of all the preachers, rebelled against the errors and impiety of these zealots, calling them from the pulpit withered trees, fit only to be burned. The next day, Boucher again began his denunciations of the Parliament and other persons, and advised their murder. Mayen limited himself to sending them letters dismissing them from their posts, and ordering them to leave Paris immediately and go to the cities of the Union. Since he had been informed on the priest of the Church of St. Sulpice, he threatened to roll him the same pill as the others if he did not hasten to correct himself. What the preachers said about the attempts to tear Henry away from Calvinism was true enough. We have already spoken of Villeroy's negotiations with this object. This statesman, by order of Mayen, continued his attempts after the departure of the Duke of Parma, but without success. Mayen gained nothing from this and became more and more suspicious in the eyes of the 16, who communicated directly with the Roman court and the Spanish king, and always sought to predominate in the party. Among the Catholics who were on Henry's side, many began to loudly express their displeasure at the failure to keep the king's promises. They said that they were too slow and had tolerated the Huguenot king too long, against their conscience, and that they should ask him, even demand, to accept Catholicism within a certain period of time, determined by them, and in the event of failure to fulfill this condition, they should declare that they were abandoning him, join the League, and altogether proceed to elect a Catholic king, either from the princes of the royal family, or, in the event of their refusal, from other houses. The Protestants, for their part, complained of Henry, whose hesitation seemed suspicious to them. They threatened, in the event of his conversion to Catholicism, not to lay down their arms until they had obtained the most advantageous edicts and the most reliable guarantees for their implementation. They even wanted to choose another patron for their church in his place. These demands of two opposing parties plunged Henry into great uneasiness. The majority of zealous Catholics, he said to Sully, are tired of the war and would not mind leaving me to join the League, with which they would get on better than with the Huguenots, which they do not hide. What Henry feared was soon to come true. The dissatisfied Catholics elected Cardinal Bourbon Vendôme of the Condé line as king and formed the so-called Third Party, Thiers' party. Cardinal Vendôme wrote to the Pope, asking his aid and protection. Jean Touchard, the abbot of Belozan, and Jacques Duperon were the most supporters of his strange pretensions. In order to deprive this party of the means of injuring him, Henry feigned ignorance, asked Cardinal Vendôme to come to him at Mantes, and received him and his principal adherents with great honors, endeavoring to bind them to himself by favors. On their arrival, Henry convoked a council, to which they were admitted. Some prelates who did not belong to the party of Vendôme were also invited. At first it was proposed to repeal some of the decrees wrested from Henry III by the League, and to make a declaration in favor of the Protestants, to confirm the reconciliatory edicts and to consolidate peace in the state. Cardinal Vendôme opposed this, and thought to interrupt the conference by his withdrawal. None of the prelates present followed him. The declaration was accepted and registered in the Parliament sitting at Tours. At the same session another very energetic declaration was drawn up against the exhortatory letter which Gregory XIV had just issued against Henry and his adherents. This pope had received letters from the party of the 16, which were in complete agreement with the information given him in Rome by the legate Cajetan. Luxembourg had tried in vain to clarify the state of affairs in a fine letter written in the name of the Catholics who belonged to Henry's party. Gregory responded with 2 letters of admonition, delivered to France by the nuncio Landriano. One was addressed to all the clergy, the other to the princes, lords, and all who belonged to Henry's party. Gregory ordered the clergy, under pain of excommunication and dismissal from their duties, to leave the party within a fortnight. He made the greatest threats to the secular people. In both letters of admonition, Henry was declared a heretic who had returned to schism, a persecutor of the Church, excommunicated from her, deprived of his kingdom and his possessions. Gregory also sent a letter to Séguier, the vice-legate in France, ordering him to try to elect a Catholic king. Séguier officially declared that France would enjoy peace during the reign of the king who would be elected. Ultramontanism believed in its triumph. At the very time when the Pope was replying to the letter of the Royal Catholics with these exhortatory letters, he sent a flattering letter to the fanatical party of the 16. Here are some extracts from it. Gregory XIV Pope, to my beloved sons, members of the Council of the 16 quarters of the city of Paris. Beloved, may the greeting and apostolic blessing be with you. We received your letters and read them with pleasure, for no news could be more pleasant to us than the news that, with God's help, you have been delivered from this long and disastrous siege, and that, having endured much labor, suffering, hardship and adversity in defense of the Catholic faith, you have now received relief and are freed from danger. Having called upon the 16 to be firm and promised them help, the Pope continues. We are very pleased with your praises of our beloved son Cardinal Cajetan, partly because of his merits, since he has very well and commendably fulfilled the commission entrusted to him by the Holy Father, and partly for the sake of the whole kingdom, which he never ceases to defend before us with amazing persistence. Gregory ends his letter with the following advice. You must put aside all earthly attachments, all desires and hopes for personal benefits and acquisitions. In your soul and heart, and before your eyes, you must always maintain only the confession of faith and the Catholic Church, on which all your well-being depends. You must settle all quarrels and disagreements, or at least put them aside until the time when you will have the most Christian and truly Catholic sovereign, under whose protection you can enjoy happy peace, and under whose guidance you will follow the path of love and obedience. This approval from Rome redoubled the fury of the 16. Henry ordered, as has been said, the Assembly of Mannes to draw up a very energetic declaration against the Pope's admonitory letters. In it the king declares that on his accession to the throne he had promised the Catholics to preserve their freedom of religion and to study their faith, and that the League had, in essence, no religious motive, since the Catholics were fully assured of both freedom and protection. Pope Sixtus V understood this well towards the end of his reign, but his successor, on the simple denunciation of the Leaguers, issued letters of admonition against Henry, in which he tried to make him out to be an enemy of the Church, which was a complete lie, as evidence of which the following statements were cited. We declare again, and, in accordance with our last declaration, we swear by God, that we desire nothing more than the convocation of a holy and free council, or other assembly of some kind to decide on controversial questions in which the Catholic Church is competent. We promise and swear to protect the Catholic, Roman, and Apostolic Church in all its rights and privileges, without allowing any alteration, violation, or attack, as more fully set forth in our previous declaration, which we confirm, approve, and ratify. As a result of the nuncio's action, although the errors that caused it are so obvious that any trial on this matter is superfluous, we have decided to submit this matter to the ordinary court, according to the laws and customs of our country. Therefore, we order all our parliamentary courts to immediately and promptly institute proceedings against the aforementioned nuncio and all that he has done in our state. We also call upon the cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and other prelates of the state to assemble quickly and take legal measures, in accordance with the holy decrees and laws, to protect themselves from the aforementioned letters of admonition. On the very day that the Pope wrote his charter to the 16, he elevated his nephew, Hercules Sfondrata, to the dignity of Duke of Monte Marciano, gave him the baton of Commander-in-Chief of the army, which he was sending for the League, and consecrated for him 2 banners. On one was inscribed, Noec est victoria quae vincit mundum fides nostra, that is, our faith is the victory that conquers the world. And on the other, Dextra Domini fecit virtutum, Dextra Domini exaltavit me, that is, the right hand of the Lord has given me courage, the right hand of the Lord has exalted me. The Spanish king and the Duke of Savoy were also arming themselves to help the League. Henry appealed to England and Germany for help. The Duke of Parma again entered France. With the help of the Italian army, he raised the siege of Rouen and returned to Belgium. Lesdiguières, who had fought bravely in Dauphiné for the king, defeated the Duke of Savoy. Henry continued his conquests, and towards the end of 1591 he had surrounded Paris even more closely. From the time the siege was raised, he blockaded that city from a distance and made the supply of provisions very difficult. The party of the 16 did all they could to keep up the fanaticism of the Parisians. The flight of the young Duke of Guise, who had been a prisoner at Tours since the death of his father, revived their hopes. These cruel men became even more arrogant towards Mayenne, making new demands on him, which were left unanswered. At the same time, they wrote to the King of Spain expressing their desire that the young Duke of Guise, by marrying his daughter, the Infanta, should ascend the throne of France. The Spanish party hoped by this means to attract to themselves those of the Leaguers who did not wish to submit to a foreign prince. At that time, Mayenne was not in Paris. The 16 took advantage of this and stirred up a rebellion against the Parliament, which was preventing the implementation of some of their plans. President Brisson and some other suspicious persons were hanged. Boucher, the priest of the Church of Saint Benoit, was busy with a project for a new parliament, which would have a special court to judge heretics and villains, condemning them to be burned, chamber ardente, a kind of committee of public safety, which would have the duty of searching for suspicious persons. The priest of the Church of St. Andrew, with several other fanatics like him, even drew up a list of such suspicious persons in advance and determined the punishment that was to befall them by one of three letters, V.K.I., that is, gallows, dagger, exile. As you can see, the Jesuits were revolutionaries who stopped at nothing. At last Mayen returned to Paris and hanged 4 of the 16. The preachers proclaimed them martyrs. Mayen perceived that every day the power was slipping more and more from his hands, and that young Guise was an opponent whom he could not conquer. On the other hand, he saw how Henry's forces were growing and pressing Paris, the last stronghold of the Leaguers, so he seriously conceived the idea of a reconciliation, and Villeroy continued his negotiations. But the preachers of the Jesuit party howled like madmen against the proposed conclusion of peace. The Jesuit commonwealth was the more zealous against peace, because the Jesuit order, already so hated in France, had acquired so many enemies during the rage of the League. Thus peace threatened him with great dangers. Clement VIII, who succeeded Gregory XIV, deceived by the Jesuits and the legate Cajetan, rejected all attempts by Henry to return to Catholicism. He sent Sedge a new charter with the order to elect a Catholic king for France again. No one listened to him. In Paris, a strong counterparty formed against the Jesuits and the 16, and decided to send deputies to Henry to invite Simondre, him to convert to Catholicism, so that he could be recognized as king. Then, the Jesuit preachers made the inviters, seminaries, the theme of their sermons. On November 1st, says Pierre de la Toile, Master Boucher excommunicated the inviters who belonged to his parish and deprived them of the sacrament. The next day he said in a sermon that there were souls who had taken it into their heads to send to the Béarnais and receive him if he agreed to become a Catholic. As for himself, the preacher, he would not mind if the Béarnais acquired the kingdom of heaven and remained there, where he would not be able to deceive anyone. But he could not be admitted to France, for he was a deceiver. On the same day, Rose announced in a sermon that those who had advised sending ambassadors to Béarn should be dealt with, and then, attacking the politicians, this priest deprived them of purgatory and sent them straight to hell. On November 8th, the priest of St. Andrew's said in a sermon that the inviters should be seized and that they were all worthless. The priest of St. Germain declared on the same day that he did not believe that the virtuous people of his parish were the inviters, and that they would all sign this paper, and expressed the opinion that the paper should be burned and never remembered. And yet, the day after All Saints' Day, he raised a cry that everything should be thrown into the river. That was the kind of head this man had. Certain clergy and monks, having met together, declared that they would never acknowledge the Bernien as king, even if he were to become a Catholic. The Jesuit Sorbonne published the sentence against the inviters, in which their petition was declared stupid, scandalous, and impious, since it was contrary to the divine law, civil and canonical, the will of Clement VIII, the oath of union, the glory which Paris had acquired in the eyes of God and man, and besides, it was submitted to an incompetent judge, since only the Pope could decide this matter. On this basis, the learned men came to the conclusion that the inviters were bad citizens, fickle, perjurers, seditious, violators of the public good, heretics, sinners, suspected of heresy and excommunicated from the church. As a result of all this, they had to be expelled from the city, so that these black sheep would not infect the whole flock. The learned and preachers also addressed themselves to the Duke of Mayenne with a bold request for the renewal of the oath of union before the legate, for the prohibition of speaking of the agreement with the King of Navarre, for the appointment of confessors and preachers to the troops, for the distribution of church parishes according to the decrees of the Council of Trent, for the convocation of the Diet in the shortest possible time, and for the adoption of measures against political conspiracies. The Council of State responded to only some of these demands. This answer made the preachers even more angry. They went from the frying pan into the fire, says Caillou, and began to revile even the Duke of Mayenne so much that he hated them, as did all the decent people of the Union party. From that time on, the influence of the preachers began to decline every day, as did the influence of the 16. The politicians published witty satires on them, among others the satire of Minippy, which ridiculed both the League and the Same. The bag of gold coins of Philip II was the real motive of the League, of which Catholicism was only a pretext. The satire reveals the cunning of the Jesuits, with which they threw forward a crowd of fools who served them to achieve their goal, and who were exposed to all kinds of dangers much more than themselves. But their cunning was not so subtle that their projects and intrigues were not noticed, and to them, in all fairness, were attributed all the crimes committed in this sad time. In particular, they led the Spanish party under the cover of religion, with the help of the 16, and their pupils Boucher, Cayley and others, and of them it was rightly said, "The scholars of the pretended union think, by their mad doctrine, to transform the veil of religion into a Spanish cloak." The caricatures represented the Jesuits, surrounded by Sorbonnists and other clergy, searching their breviaries for texts against the Salic law, in order to clear the way for the Spanish Infanta to the throne. During this occupation, a shower of gold fell upon them. Some of them collected it, while others had their hoods full of gold. The greed of the Jesuits was fully exposed. Their spirit of conquest is celebrated in the following sonnet. Holy Brotherhood, chosen to reveal hidden secrets to men, to correct the evils caused and to restore the Church. Beloved of Jesus Christ, you have managed to so atone for our sins by your merits that we can safely boast that instead of small fish you catch trout. Secretaries of God, the Church and men, and God, and Jesus Christ implore you to pull your nets out of the blue sea, for you could, in the end, fish out, catch with a hook and drive out of the world the Church, men and God and Christ. In a caricature of the procession of the League, a Jesuit stands in the most conspicuous place and shows the doorman the way. This defined the true place of the order, for the Jesuits had organized the Holy Union and inspired it with their fanaticism. They governed everything by means of their brotherhoods of the name of Jesus, whose members promised to support the League and never to recognize Henry of Navarre as king. The satire puts the following speech into the mouth of the Archbishop of Lyons in a parody of a meeting of the Diet. Continue to maintain the brotherhoods of the name of Jesus and Vervail, for these are good collars for the common people, and we entrust this to the honor and conscience of our good Jesuit fathers, and to them we entrust our spies, so that they may continue to bring news of us to Spain and receive the secret orders of His Catholic Majesty, to be transmitted to the envoys, agents, priests, monasteries, church wardens, and superiors of the brotherhoods. Let the Jesuit fathers not forget in confession, under pain of eternal perdition, to forbid their flocks to desire peace or to speak of it. Let the people be ready to be plundered and burned rather than submit to the Burnian, even if he goes to Mass, as the envoys assure him before the Pope. But we know the antidote well, if that were to happen, and we will arrange it so that His Holiness will believe nothing, and even if he believes, he will do nothing, and if he does, we will get nothing, unless I am a cardinal. It was impossible to describe the attitude of the Jesuits to the League better. In the satirical writings of the time, they are openly credited with participating in the murder of Henry III. It is said that they entered into an agreement with the prior of the Jacobins and Madame Montpensier to win over Jacques Clement and persuade him to commit the murder. It was even said loudly that they were ready to create a second such holy martyr so that the League could canonize him. The most brutal measures taken in favor of Spanish rule belonged to those who did not leave the Jesuits and did not confess to anyone else. The apologists of the Jesuits asserted that, during the time of the League, the Jesuits were no more guilty than the members of the Sorbonne, the judges, the citizens, the people, and the monks who had joined the League. They forgot to add that the most cruel Leaguers were the friends and disciples of the Jesuits, who acted under their instigation, that the order must answer for the deeds committed under its influence, and that in the most terrible deeds most of its members hid in the shadows only in order to direct the blows more conveniently. The Jesuits were the most criminal of the Leaguers. They inspired the most cruel theories and crimes, with the object of placing a foreign prince on the throne of France and increasing the influence of their order. These are facts which impartial history must record and condemn. In spite of the efforts of the Jesuits, the French party of the League gained the upper hand. Consultations were held between the members of this party and the adherents of Henry. Henry finally renounced Protestantism, and thus won over to his side all who hated foreign domination. Negotiations for the acquittal of the king began between the French court and the Pope. The Spaniards did everything they could to hinder them, and were assisted by the Jesuits Taulet and Passivin. The order always knew how to keep some of its members in reserve for emergencies, so that they could renounce compromising acts for which its perpetrators could be accused, if they failed to observe due secrecy and caution. Sometimes such a policy is successful, but it cannot deceive the historian. While the negotiations with Rome were in progress, Henry, solemnly united to the Church by the French bishops, was crowned and entered Paris on the 22nd of March, 1594. Brissac, the governor of the city, and the principal citizens and members of the parliament, cleverly deceived the foreigners who formed the garrison, and took such excellent measures that Henry was able to enter Paris unarmed. On meeting him, Brissac presented him with an embroidered baldric and was immediately made a marshal of France. Louvelier, the merchant elder, handed the king the keys of the city. As it was rumored that the Spaniards intended to resist, Henry donned his arms, but these foreigners were glad of the opportunity of obtaining permission to retire to Flanders with their arms and property. The king rode through the city, enthusiastically greeted by the people, who had long been tired of the domination of the 16 and the Spaniards. Having visited the principal quarters, Henry took off his armor and went to the Church of Our Lady to hear Mass and to thank God for such a happy success. 600 men went before him, dragging their lances as a sign of their voluntary victory, and thousands of joyful cries of the people mingled with the sounds of military music and the solemn ringing of the bells of Our Lady. As the archbishop and the mayor were absent, Senior Drey, one of the archdeacons, met Henry at the main entrance, knelt down and handed him a crucifix with the following words: "Sire, you must praise and thank God well, because he, having allowed you to be born a member of the most worthy royal family, has preserved your honor and now restores your property to you. In giving thanks now, you must take care of your people, just as our Lord Jesus Christ, whose image you now see, took care of his. By your care and your protection you will make them pray even more for your welfare and health, and being a good king, you will receive a good people." The king answered, "I infinitely praise and thank God for the mercies sent to me, which are so great that I do not know how to thank them, especially for my conversion to the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman faith, in which I promise, with God's help, to live and die. As for the defense of my people, I am always ready to shed all my blood to the last drop. I will try with all my might to help the people, and I swear to this by God, the Holy Virgin, and all the saints." After these words, the king kissed the crucifix, entered the church, and knelt before the high altar. He listened to the Mass, during which a thanksgiving service was sung with the music of voices and organs. The proclamation of amnesty in all parts of the city worthily concluded this day. Several leaguers conceived the idea of offering resistance. Hamilton, the priest of St. Cosmas, came with 2 or 3 others, armed with a halberd. On learning what had happened, he immediately disappeared, and all rumors of him disappeared. Pelve, Archbishop of Sens, one of the principal leaguers, lay ill in bed. Although he had been informed, by order of the king, that he was in no danger, he fell into a terrible delirium, in which he cried out incessantly, "Take him! Take him!" The next day he died. The legate, who had received the same information as Pelve, left Paris without seeing the king. The most fanatical of the leaguers, such as Cayley, Pelletier, Boucher, some others, and most of the preachers who had desecrated the pulpit with impious and terrible speeches, were ordered to leave Paris. Some mended their ways. The Jesuit Comelet, who had called upon some AUD to kill Henry from the pulpit, began to shower the king with the most exaggerated praises as soon as he learned of his victory. The people, believing Henry's words, lit fires, around which some sang, "We praise thee, God," and others cried, "Long live the king!" Anthony Loisel and Pierre Pittot, by order of the king, struck out of the registers of Parliament all the decrees illegally issued by the League. The Sorbonne hastened to do the same with the famous decrees of which we have spoken. On the 22nd of April the Sorbonnists, freed from the influence of the Jesuit henchmen, held a solemn meeting to swear allegiance to the king and sign the following declaration. Since some ignorant and prejudiced people have tried to insidiously raise doubts in the minds of the people, pointing out that although the king, our sovereign, has firmly and sincerely converted to our holy Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman faith, our most holy Father, the Pope, has not publicly recognized him as the eldest son of the Church, which could give rise to doubt in these people whether they should obey him as the legitimate sovereign, all-merciful and sole heir to the kingdom. Then we, after mature deliberation, and humbly thanking God and all the powers of heaven for such an obvious conversion of the king and for his ardent devotion to our mother the Holy Church, as well as for such a peaceful conquest of the capital of France, unanimously came to the following resolution. The aforementioned king and sovereign Henry is the legitimate and true Catholic king, the natural ruler of France and Navarre, according to the fundamental laws of these states, and therefore all his subjects and all who live within the boundaries of his dominions are obliged to voluntarily obey him, as the Lord commands, despite the fact that, through the intrigues of some enemies in the Spanish party, He has not yet been received by the Holy Father and recognized as a worthy and beloved son of our mother, the Holy Catholic Church, which happened by no means through the fault of the king, as everyone knows. In the rest of their declaration, the learned Sorbonnists swear allegiance to Henry and exclude from their midst anyone who does not follow their example. If there are any disobedient ones, they say, we exclude them from our midst, deprive them of our privileges and turn away from them as rebels, insulters of majesty, public enemies, and troublemakers. After this excommunication, the members of the university invite all true Frenchmen and good Catholics to pay their respects to the king like them. Some of the doctors compromised during the League have submitted. Most of those who drew up the famous decrees against Henry have already left Paris. Of all the monks, only the Jesuits and Capuchins refused to join in this declaration. Struck by the revolution they had witnessed, and hoping that it would be short-lived, they declared that they would await the Pope's orders before deciding on anything. At last they decided to submit. It was thought that they had only this object in mind, to conceal their most insidious designs under the cover of this apparent submission. The facts will show that this was really so. In conclusion of this too brief account of the horrors of the League, let us observe that at this sad time Ultramontanism showed its activity. The Jesuits and Ultramontanes, their allies, proud of their successes and their influence over the people, do not conceal either their bloodthirsty theories or their anti-national intentions. They were true to their rules. If ever the Ultramontane system, as absurd as it is terrible, and a disgrace to the Catholic Church, should succeed in seizing power, we should see the same fanaticism and the same horrors under the hypocritical mask of religious zeal. Hypocrisy and cruelty are the necessary attributes of the Jesuit or Ultramontane system. Chapter 3, 1594 to 1598. The desperate resistance which the Jesuits had made to Henry IV gave the university an opportunity to resume the litigation with them, which had been temporarily interrupted by the influence of Catherine de' Medici and other circumstances. The members of the university assembled on the 18th of April to go in solemn procession to the church to offer thanksgiving for the victory of the king, and to discuss the petition of a certain Master Laurentius Boursier, who demanded a trial of the Jesuits, in order to expel them completely. Boursier's request was granted, and the university appointed deputies from each faculty to conduct the litigation with the rector, Jacques d'Amboise. The following petition was written and submitted to the Parliament. The rector, deans of the faculties, trustees, elders and students of the University of Paris humbly petition, recalling that they have long since appealed to the court and complained of the great disorder that has arisen in the university through the fault of a certain new sect that arose in Spain and boastfully called itself the Order of the Name of Jesus. This sect has always, and especially during the recent troubles, completely gone over to the side of the Spanish party, to the great evil of the whole state, both in the city of Paris and in the whole French kingdom and beyond it, which behavior of its was foreseen from its very inception by the petitioners, as is evident from the decree of the theological faculty, then published. In this decree it was indicated that the aforementioned sect seeks to disrupt all order in the Church, both political and hierarchical, as well as in the aforementioned university, refusing to obey the archbishops, bishops, priests, and other ecclesiastical authorities. 30 years ago, members of the above-mentioned order, who had not yet managed to poison other French cities with their influence, except Paris, petitioned to be admitted to the bosom of the university. This request was heard in council, which decided that things should remain in status quo, that is, the Jesuits had no right to do anything against this sentence. Meanwhile, not only did they not submit to this, but, entangling state affairs with malicious intent, they served as spies and henchmen of Spain, which is obvious to everyone. This petition, heard in council, was not presented to the court, and thus all the terms were missed. In view of all the above, please, gentlemen of the judges, order the expulsion of this sect not only from the university, but also from all of France, with the assistance of the king's prosecutor, and you will do well. The Jesuits tried to sow dissent in the university, which included several Ligists, friends of the Jesuits. They succeeded in getting some members of the faculties of law, medicine, and fine arts to express their disapproval, and the theological faculty to pass the following resolution. On July 9, 1594, the theological faculty, legally assembled in the great hall of the Sorbonne College, examined and heard the petition submitted to the faculty by the venerable fathers of the Order of Jesus. In this petition, the Jesuit fathers stated that several months before this, the venerable rector of the university had submitted a petition to Parliament in his name and that of all the faculties for the expulsion of the entire Order of Jesus from all over France. But the Fathers added that it was unlikely that the theological faculty would participate in this petition, and therefore they begged this faculty to announce publicly that it was not at all in solidarity with such a demand. The theological faculty, having maturely discussed this question, came to the conclusion that the above-mentioned Fathers of the Order of Jesus should submit to the decrees and rules of the university, but that they should not be expelled from France. This resolution, illegally adopted, was rejected by Parliament, and the disapproval of several members of the faculty, former Leaguers, did not prevent the process from being considered as being conducted on behalf of the entire university. Having failed in this direction, the Jesuits turned to Cardinal Bourbon Vendôme, nephew of the old king of the League, who recommended the Jesuits to the Protestant Sully, knowing his influence with Henry. Sully visited the ailing cardinal, and the latter did his utmost to win him over to the Jesuits. "It is impossible," he said, "to do violence to them now, when so many Catholics do not wish to believe in the sincerity of the king's conversion." Sully believed that it was to Henry's advantage to spare the Jesuits, and he defended them before the king. Cardinal La Rochefoucauld wanted to intervene in the case as Bishop of Clermont, and heir of a bishop who had left the Jesuits a rich endowment for the maintenance of the College of Clermont. The Duke of Nevers also wanted to take part in the case as a benefactor of the Jesuits, but their petitions were not accepted by the Parliament, which set the trial for July 12. This lawsuit greatly excited the minds of the people. The Jesuits threatened to expose the former Leaguers, whom they found among their judges. On the other hand, stories were circulating among the people about everything they themselves had done during the League. The threats of the Jesuits forced the Parliament to consider the case behind closed doors, at the request of Duret, the lawyer of the Jesuits. Henry considered it his duty to remind the judges of moderation. He wrote to the Chancellor Cheverny, a supporter of the Jesuits, a letter in which he said the following: "I have learned from Sully what is happening in Paris between the university, the Parisian priests, and the Jesuits. In accordance with Sully's advice and the explanations he presented to the council, I intend to give justice a free hand, without partiality, violating the laws, regulations, and institutions of the state. Therefore, I do not want to hinder or interfere with the litigants from filing any complaints, petitions, or defending themselves, but I want everything to happen seriously and modestly, and also that speeches, if they come to them, would be made without fuss, so as not to stir up unrest. I do not want the judges to pronounce their final sentence without first communicating it to me." The Parisian priests, by agreement with the university, renewed their case against the Jesuits. Their defender was Louis Dahl. The university's advocate was Antoine Arnauld. Duret's speech in defense of the Jesuits was not printed, but those of Dahl and Arnauld were published and made a great impression, especially that of Antoine Arnauld. The Jesuits never forgot it. It may be considered the main reason for their eternal hatred of the Arnauld family, and later of Port Royal. Antoine Arnauld was a man of very strict principles. St. Francis Delaware Sales had the greatest respect for him, as is evident from his letters. Arnauld had 22 children, of whom we will mention only Arnauld d'Andely, the elder, and the famous Dr. Antoine Arnauld, the youngest and most famous. His daughters, Angelica and Agnes, nuns of the convent of Port Royal, were women of masculine intelligence and amazing virtue. The head of this patriarchal family showed his children an example of all virtues. According to Chibo, minister of Innocent XI, the Arnaulds were a family of heroes. Arnauld had been a witness of the crimes committed by the Jesuits during the League. He himself belonged to the party of the Catholic Royalists, or politicals, so often condemned to excommunication and death by the preachers of the order. It is not surprising that his speech in defense was distinguished by such passion and force. It must be remarked, however, that his indignation never made him overstep the bounds of truth. "Gentlemen," he said, "I begin my speech with a declaration exactly contrary to that made by our adversaries. Yesterday they spread the rumor everywhere that our case would be tried behind closed doors, on account of their threats to denounce certain persons who had returned to obedience to their sovereign. I, on the contrary, promise not to offend anyone, not even the most genuine Spaniard, by word or hint." According to Arnauld, the Jesuits were the obvious friends of the Spanish king. Everyone knows that during the League the Jesuits stirred up all France in favor of the Spanish king Philip II. "Nobody doubts this," said Arnauld. except people who are either so timid that they still consider themselves in the hands of the 16 thieves and their Jesuit leaders, or who belong to the Jesuit order and have taken the most dangerous of their vows, since a whole city can be Jesuit. With the help of almighty gold, Charles V and Philip II, his successor, tried to create in Europe the same universal monarchy that the Turks had created in Asia. They easily won over the Roman court, establishing benefices in Milan, Naples, Sicily, and Spain. But, says Arnauld, as ponderous and immobile as the buildings and everything else in these cities were, so light and mobile must have been the people who were entrusted with the organization and further success of Spanish affairs. Such were the Jesuits, who spread everywhere in terrible numbers, for there are already from 9 to 10,000 of them, and they have already founded 228 Spanish colonies. They own an income of over 2 million in gold, counties and large baronial estates in Spain and Italy, and have already reached the cardinals' places, preparing to occupy the papal throne. If they remain for another 30 years in their present positions, they will undoubtedly be the richest and most powerful order in the Christian world, and they will begin to maintain mercenary troops, for which they are already giving money. Arnauld proves, by reference to the testimony of Vladimir, that the Jesuits are devoted to the Spaniards. He draws attention to the fact that up to now all the generals of the order have been Spanish subjects. Loyola, the first general of the Jesuits, was a Spaniard, as was Lainez, the second general. The third, Everardus, was a Fleming, a Spanish subject. The fourth, Borja, was a Spaniard, and the fifth, the present one, was a Neapolitan, a Spanish subject. During the League they won the Sorbonne over to the side of the Spanish king, thanks to the large number of their pupils, such as Boucher Pigeon, the brother of the provincial, Vladimir, Semmel, Cayley, Decret, Aubourg, educated by the Jesuits and who formed the majority at the Sorbonne after the departure of the old doctors from Paris, fleeing the tyranny of the 16. The young scholars were imbued with the ultramontane doctrine and the Jesuit hatred of the privileges of the Gallic Church, which, according to Arnauld, the Jesuits called abuses and corruptions of morals. Richer, who later became famous for his opposition to ultramontanism, was educated by the Jesuits in the same rules. He confesses that for the new Sorbonne founded by the Jesuits, Bellarmine replaced the Holy Fathers and the whole Catholic tradition. "Brave and invincible Church of Gaul," cries Arnauld, "your members were true Frenchmen, true Christians, true religious men, true monks, whose first vow was to obey per omnia et in omnibus the commandments of God, ever just, and not all the attacks of Rome and Spain upon Gaul. But since your enemies, united against your greatness, sent upon you these new colonies of Spaniards, these monasteries of murderers, who take a solemn vow to obey their general as Jesus Christ himself, come down to earth, and to kill with their own hands or through the help of trained murderers kings and princes, since then, I say, all the good intentions of the Church of Gaul have disappeared." Following these general remarks on the position of the Jesuits in France and the evil they had done, Arnauld asks whether they could be left there. He casts a cursory glance at their Spanish origin and asserts that they were the soul of the League. "Whose language, whose voice," he exclaims, "can express and depict all the secret councils, all the conspiracies, more terrible than those of the Bacchanals, more dangerous than that of Catalino, hatched in their college in the street of St. James and in their church in the street of St. Anthony? Where did the envoys and agents of Spain, such as Mendoza, de Guillen, Diego de Vara, Tachis, Feria and others, hold their most secret meetings, if not with the Jesuits? Where, if not with them, did Luchart, Hamelin, Crusat, Crome and other famous thieves and murderers discuss their evil plans? Where, if not with the Jesuits, did the two cardinals, who called themselves legates of France, meet for consultation? Where, if not in the Jesuit college, did the 16 meet, under the Spanish envoy Mendoza, on All Saints' Day 1589, when the king stormed the suburbs of Paris? Where was it decided the following year to starve 9/10 of the inhabitants of Paris rather than surrender to the king? Who lent wine, wheat, and oats on the security of the royal jewels, if not the Jesuits, from whom Lugoli found them the day after the king's entry into the city? Who presided over the council of the 16 thieves, if not Carmelite Bernard, and Father Odin Pigeon, that fierce tiger, so distressed that things had not gone as he wished, that he went mad, and to this day sits tied up in their college at Bourges? According to Arnauld, the Jesuits corrupt the youth, kidnap children from their parents, and, through them, swindle their families out of their property. 30. He calculates that during their 30 years in France they have acquired 200,000 livres of annual income. He confirms his words with positive and well-known facts. Having thus established that the Jesuits, on account of their conspiracies, their pernicious doctrine, and the criminal acts they had committed, could not be tolerated in France, Arnauld proceeds to the process between them and the university, which had been interrupted in 1564. He points out that this process is no longer the same, since in 1564 the Jesuits were plaintiffs, while in 1594 they were only defendants before the university, which demanded their expulsion from France, and therefore they could not avail themselves of the decision of the council. Arnauld particularly insists on the changed circumstances. There is a great difference between the years 1564 and 1594, he says. In 1564, evil was feared and many did not want to admit its possibility, deceived by the sweet words of these hypocrites. Who could have thought at that time that Spanish mercenaries would walk the streets of Paris, arms akimbo, frowning, with slow and important steps? In 1564, Fathers Bernard and Comelitos did not call the king Holofernes, Moab, Nero, did not assert that the French throne belonged to the sovereign elected by the people, and did not quote the following saying from the Old Testament: Eliges fratrum tuum in regem, you will choose your brother as king. Fratrum tuum, they said, does not mean a man of the same race as you, nor even of the same people as you, but of the same faith as you, like the great Catholic King of Spain. Besides the changed circumstances, it is obvious to everyone that the Jesuits have not observed a single clause of the treaty drawn up at Poissy, and have thereby destroyed the treaty itself. They could not rely on this treaty or on any other, since they had not fulfilled it, and the treaty itself stipulates that it will lose its force if the Jesuits violate any of its clauses. In conclusion of his speech, Arnauld answered some of the objections made to him, and in a brilliant epilogue addressed himself to the king himself, begging him to expel the Spanish spies from France. Perhaps, he said, they would conceal their evil intentions for a time, but their only dream would be to assassinate the king and place Philip II on the French throne. The conclusion of this speech was that the Jesuits must be expelled from France within 15 days, and that every member of the order who found himself in France after this period should be considered a state criminal. After Arnauld, Louis Dahl spoke in defense of the priests who had remained in Paris during the League and had resisted the violence of the Jesuits and the 16. Most of the rest had retained their parishes, thanks to the amnesty of Henry IV. It is not surprising that they did not join their brothers in demanding the expulsion of those whose errors they shared. Louis Dahl noted this circumstance. He also attacked the sentence of the Sorbonne, on which the Jesuits relied, and declared that it had been drawn up by members of the new Sorbonne, who had been mixed up in the affairs of the Jesuits, and who feared exposure by people who were well aware of their behavior during the League. Pierre Barny, the attorney of the Jesuits in France, defended the order before the Parliament and responded to the demands and speeches of the university and the Parisian priests. On the basis of the latest decree of the Sorbonne and the statements of some private individuals, he asserted that, in essence, the university was not suing the Jesuits, and recalled the ancient charters and the Treaty of Poissy. As for the troubles of the League, he said, the Jesuits, if they attended the meetings, it was only to calm the minds. They were ready to prove their submission to Henry IV and would no longer engage in politics, since this was contrary to their rules. Religion, the poor, and the city of Paris itself would suffer from their expulsion, for during the plague they attended the sick. In a word, they would submit to all the orders of the university. As for the reproaches addressed to the order, Pierre Barny considers them empty fables. The Jesuits are no more attached to the Pope than other Catholics. They do not wish and never have sought the protection of the Spaniards. They have never received money from Philip II and are not guilty of the League, and if others were involved in it, the amnesty of Henry IV forbids them to be remembered. Barny even denied that Comelitos ever uttered the terrible words attributed to him by the most informed historians and which were heard in the city during the disorders. It is true that the Jesuits had public treasures, but only for safekeeping. They were given to them for greater safety. The leaders of the Spanish party visited them only to hear Mass and take fast. As for the privileges of the Gallic Church, the Jesuits never touched upon them and did not call them abuses and corruption of morals, as Arnauld expressed it. Barny adds that the Jesuits are completely submissive to princes and bishops, that they respect all spiritual authority, that they fight most successfully against the Protestants in France and contribute to the flourishing of both piety and literature. If we are to believe this defense speech, the Jesuits were completely innocent, did not deserve any reproach, and were worthy of the respect, admiration, and gratitude of the entire state. This result was easily attained by the most exaggerated praise of oneself and the impudence of denying irrefutably proven facts. Barney had noted a few minor inaccuracies in Arnaud's speech, but in reality he could only deny those points which Arnaud had confirmed by their general notoriety, by thousands of witnesses, and by irrefutable facts. The speech of Duret, the Jesuits' advocate, must have been even weaker than Barney's, for the Jesuits contented themselves with praising it, but did not publish it. During the trial, public opinion was greatly excited against the Jesuits. The professors attacked them from the pulpit. Jean Pasra, professor of eloquence at the College of France, loudly declared that he would have these harpies, whose very touch defile a man, these featherless, bipedal beasts in black robes, expelled from France. All those who were not members of the League and did not fear their revelations mocked the Jesuits, but the Parliament and the Sorbonne were filled with Leaguers, whose past was well known to the Jesuits. Henry IV himself, on the advice of Sully, thought it expedient to spare the Jesuits in order to appease the Pope and the Catholics, who did not believe in the sincerity of his appeal. The trial was therefore again interrupted, and the speeches for the defense and the petitions were added to the other documents, so that the whole affair could be decided by one and the same sentence. The president, Anton de Thou, openly declared that to leave such a trial without a decision would be to expose the life of the king. He was right, and the assassination attempt by Jean Châtel, which took place shortly afterwards, confirmed both his and Arnaud's fears. Jean Châtel was the son of a clothier who lived near the court. On December 27, 1594, he entered the hotel of Gabriel d'Estrées near the Louvre, where Henry IV entered with a crowd of courtiers. At the moment when the king was embracing Seigneur de Montigny, Châtel stabbed him in the upper lip with a knife. Dropping the knife, he was so confused that he did not even think of running away. His confusion betrayed him. Montigny seized him with the words, "Either you or I, one of us has wounded the king." Châtel was seized and, by order of Chancellor de Cheverny, taken to the conciergerie. Henry's wound was not serious, so that he was able to attend the Thanksgiving service celebrated in the Church of Notre Dame on the occasion of his miraculous deliverance from danger. At the interrogation, Châtel testified that he had studied for 3 years with the Jesuits, that a few days before the attempt, he had visited Father Garrett, his former tutor, that the Jesuits had explained to him that the king was excommunicated, that he could be killed, and that he should not be considered king until he was confirmed in his rank by the Holy Father. The enemies of the Jesuits took advantage of this opportunity to implicate them in this criminal and vile affair. Rumors spread in Paris that the Jesuits had attempted to assassinate the king, and the people would have torn them to pieces if troops had not been sent to protect their college and monasteries. During the trial of Châtel, some judges, on behalf of the Parliament, went to the College of the Jesuits and seized various papers, including books written by the hand of Jean Guignard, a priest of the Jesuit order. These were lampoons composed by him after the decree of oblivion and forgiveness of offenses against the king. These books praised the murder of Henry III and gave reasons for the murder of his successor. The entire teaching of these books was reduced to the following 9 propositions. 1. If in 1572 on St. Bartholomew's Day they had let blood from the royal vein, we would not have ended up, as we do now, from a sack to a mat. We made a concession to them in blood, and they flooded all of France with blood and fire. The ferocious Nero, Henry III, was killed by the merciful, a play on the word clement, and the pretended monk died at the hands of the true monk. Shall we call Nero, Sardanapalus, the Bernese fox, the lion, the king of Portugal, the she-wolf, the queen of England, the griffin, the king of Sweden, or the boar, the king of Saxony, king of France? Think what it was like to see these 3 kings, if they can be considered kings, the late tyrant, Henry III, the Bernese, and the pretended king of Portugal, Don Antonio, the enemy of the Spanish king. The best anagram of the late tyrant's name is, O. Le Vilain Herods. O Val Herod. The heroic deed of Jacques Clement is a gift of the Holy Spirit. It is so called by our theologians and deservedly praised by the late abbot of the Jacobites, Bourguin, confessor and martyr, both in Paris, where I heard him with my own ears when he preached his Judith, and before the Parliament at Tours. Bourguin sealed his words with his blood and sanctified them with his death. Do not believe what his enemies assert, who say that with these words he reproached the deed of Clement and found it disgusting. The French crown can and must be transferred to another house, not the Bourbons. Since the Béarnais has converted to Catholicism, he will be treated better than he deserves if he is tonsured a monk and placed in a good monastery. where he can repent for all the crimes he committed in France and thank God for allowing him to come to his senses before death. If he cannot be removed except by war, let them fight. If they cannot fight, let them kill him. Father Guignard confessed to having composed the articles from which the above excerpts were taken. Fathers Garrett and Guy were convicted only of convincing their listeners of the legality of the king's murder. In the papers seized from the Jesuit college, they found several anagrams against Henry and student exercises dictated by the grammar teacher on the topics. One must always be prepared for death and kill tyrants. In addition, it was proven that the Jesuits forbade their students to pray for Henry, and claimed that those present at the Mass were excommunicated along with Henry. A letter was received from Bourges to the Parliament with the information that one of the students of the local Jesuit college, François Jacob, said at the very time when Châtel attempted to kill the king, that he would kill him if another had not already killed him. On the basis of these facts, the Parliament came to the conclusion that the Jesuits had provoked Châtel's attempt on his life, and that for their teaching they deserved to be exiled, and therefore passed the following sentence. The court declares that Jean Châtel is found guilty of treason against the majesty, both heavenly and earthly, by attempting to kill the person of the king. For this, the court has sentenced Jean Châtel to the following. He must confess his crime, standing before the main gate of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, barefoot, in his shirt, with a lighted wax candle weighing 2 pounds in his hands, and on his knees declare that he attempted to kill the king and wounded him in the face with a knife, and also that during the examination of this vile and terrible case, he said that it is permissible to kill kings, and that the current king, Henry IV, will be excommunicated from the church until he receives papal permission. Having repented and asked God for forgiveness, the criminal will be taken in a shameful chariot to the place de Grève, where they will tear his hands and calves with red-hot pincers. His right hand, which held the knife with which he attempted to commit regicide, shall be cut off. His body shall be tied to 4 horses and torn to pieces. Then his limbs and body shall be burned, and the ashes shall be scattered to the wind. All his property shall be confiscated in favor of the king. Before the aforementioned execution, the aforementioned Jean Châtel shall be subjected to ordinary and extraordinary torture in order that he may indicate his accomplices. It is forbidden for anyone, of whatever rank or position, under pain of being accused of treason, to utter in public or other places the aforementioned speeches, recognized by the court as seductive, seditious, contrary to the word of God and heretical. The priests and students of the College of Clermont and all members of the Jesuit order are ordered to leave Paris and other cities and places where their colleges are located within 3 days from the announcement of this order, and the kingdom within 15 days. After the expiration of the above-mentioned period, those who do not comply with this order are subject to punishment as guilty of treason. All their property, movable and immovable, will be converted to charitable works, as the court may direct. In addition, all the king's subjects are forbidden to send students to the colleges of the aforementioned order for training, under penalty of being accused of treason. Father Garrett was tortured and then exiled for life. Father Guy was simply exiled because the criminal speeches he had been made before the amnesty. As for Father Guignard, after repenting before the gates of the Church of Our Lady, kneeling, barefoot, in his shirt and holding a candle, he was taken to the place de Grève and hanged. His body was immediately burned and his property confiscated in favor of the king. It has been repeatedly stated that in the trial of the Jesuits the usual forms of justice were not observed, and that the parties were not examined. It is certain that the Jesuits were adherents of the doctrine of tyrannicide. Besides, they considered Henry IV a tyrant, and would not acknowledge him as king until they had obtained the Pope's permission. Therefore, it is possible that Châtel committed his attempt at the instigation of one of them, but their friends took pains to say everywhere that the strictest judicial formalities should have been observed before passing sentence on a whole corporation. The crimes of individuals, they said, should not have brought condemnation upon the whole order. They found fault with these formal omissions, and even declared that all the evidence against Fathers Guignard, Garrett, and Guise was false. This is what we find in the memoirs of the Chancellor Hurault de Cheverny. On the grounds that Jean Châtel had been studying for several years in the Parisian Jesuit College, the highest members of Parliament, who had long disliked the Jesuits and were only looking for a pretext to destroy them, found fault with this incident and commissioned some of their own people, true enemies of the order, to conduct a search in the Clermont Jesuit College, where these people actually found, or, as they believe, pretended to find, some papers that spoke against the royal dignity in general, and some notes against the late King Henry III and the accession to the throne of the current reigning king. These papers belonged to a Jesuit, Father Jean Guignard, a priest, and despite the fact that they resembled student exercises, the Parliament ordered the arrest of the aforementioned Guignard, together with another Jesuit, Father Alexander Gay, and to put them in the conciergerie, and to arrest all the other Jesuits in the college. Having spoken about the punishments that befell them, Chancellor de Cheverny adds, "Thus the Jesuits were driven out of Paris, to the astonishment and sorrow of many, who were not averse to the punishment of the culprits, but were very sorry that the youth were deprived of the beautiful institutions of the order." The Parliament, having confiscated all their property, decided to apply it to charitable works. First of all, having seized everything into its own hands, it erected on the site of Chatel's house a very beautiful stone pyramid, surmounted by a cross, decorated with very beautiful architectural and sculptural decorations and gilding. In it is set a black marble tablet with an inscription in gold letters containing the sentence against Jean Chatel, the decree for the expulsion of the Jesuits from France, and many other inscriptions and verses, placed on 3 sides of the pyramid, which was then copied and engraved on copper with all the inscriptions. All this was done with funds from the Jesuits, which the gentlemen members of Parliament managed during the entire absence of the Jesuits from Paris. Despite the decree of expulsion of the Paris Parliament, the Jesuits remained in Clermont, in Auvergne, in all their establishments under the jurisdiction of the League Parliaments in Toulouse and Bordeaux, and in many other cities, says Cheverny. All these statements of Cheverny are not accurate. The Chancellor wrote his memoirs under the influence of the ideas that reigned at court at the time when Henry considered it necessary to bring back the Jesuits. Of course, it would have been better if the order had been brought to trial, but could not the case be considered as having been examined after the speeches of Mesnil, Pacquier, Arnauld, Dahl, and all the facts that had come to light? If the entire order could not be condemned for the crime of Chatel, it deserved to be condemned for other reasons. On January 2, 1595, Lord Gilbert discovered a new plot against the king. The soul of this plot, besides the Spanish king, were 2 Jesuits, Guillaume and Calin. The execution was entrusted to a certain Rast. Comparing this fact with the Berrier affair, in which the Jesuit Varade was compromised, and with the affair of Jean Chatel, acting on the advice of Garrett and Guignard, Henry IX understood that he could not overcome the fanaticism of these people with benefactions and meekness, convinced that the murder of the king would be a sacrifice pleasing to God, and therefore, on January 7, 1595, he issued the following edict banishing the Jesuits. When investigating the means and methods used by people who sought to seize power and bring our state to ruin and destruction, it was discovered that members of the so-called Order of Jesus were the instigators and supporters of many evil deeds and conspiracies, both against the late king, our highly respected sovereign and brother, and against our person. All their evil deeds, instigations, and conspiracies turned out to be all the more harmful, since the main goal of these criminal people was to convince our subjects openly and secretly, under the guise of piety, that it was permissible to attempt on the life of the sovereign. Having mentioned the attempt of Berrier, committed at the instigation of the principals of the College of Clermont in Paris, as well as the crime of Chatel, in which the Jesuits participated, according to the testimony of both the murderer himself and his parents, Henry continues, "Having maturely considered the said attempt, we command the priests and students of the Clermont College, and all others belonging to the said order, in whatever place or city of our kingdom they may be, as corrupters of youth, disturbers of public peace and enemies of us, the state and the crown of France, to leave their places of residence within 3 days, counting from the day of the announcement of this decree to them, and to leave the borders of the state within 15 days. This decree was approved by the Parliament on January 21, 1596. On February 11th, it was approved by the Parliament in Rennes, on the 21st of the same month, in Dijon. On March 21st, the Languedoc Parliament, sitting in Béziers, passed an even stricter sentence on the Jesuits than the Parisian one, at the request of the prosecutor, Pierre de Belot. Since the city of Bilhem in Auvergne refused to comply with the decree of the Parisian Parliament, the latter again drew up a sentence for the expulsion of the Jesuits from Bilhem within 3 days, and from France within 15 days. Not all the Jesuits left France. Yielding to the force of circumstances, some pretended to leave the order and tried to open colleges as private individuals. On August 21, 1597, by decree of the Parisian Parliament, it was forbidden to accept Jesuits as teachers in private and public schools or others, under the pretext of their leaving the order. In spite of these sentences, the Jesuits found refuge in many places in Languedoc and Guyenne, where the Ligurians were most numerous. There they continued to intrigue in favor of the Spanish king, as Henry wrote to Marshal Matignon on April 6, 1597. Lord Tournon openly retained them in the college in his city, but the Parisian Parliament on October 1, 1597, demanded their removal. 2 weeks later, the same Parliament had to hear the case against the Jesuits again. The Lyon municipality petitioned for the retention of the head of the local college, a certain Poursan, a former Jesuit who had left the order before the Edict of 1594. Deputy Prosecutor Marion, considered one of the most incorruptible judges of that time, made an eloquent speech against the Jesuits and did not hide the fact that he had no confidence in these imaginary renunciations, which could only be a known tactic on the part of the Jesuits. Parliament decided to expel Poursan from France, but first to bring him to the Conciergerie prison in Paris and interrogate him. On November 12th, Parliament passed a sentence on the book of Father Richaume. This Jesuit, who had retired to Guyenne, had printed a book in Bordeaux, entitled 3 Discourses on the Catholic Faith. He had the courage to dedicate it to Henry. In the dedication, he furiously attacked the decree exiling the Jesuits. The book was withdrawn from sale, and the author was expelled from the state within 3 days. Henry, who later had the weakness to agree to the return of the Jesuits, as we shall soon discuss, was in a completely different mood after the attempt by Châtel. Das and du Perron, who were then in Rome seeking recognition of Henry as king, were ordered not to discuss the question of the return of the Jesuits, in case Clement VIII spoke of it. Here is what Cardinal du Perron writes about the instructions given by the king to his commissioners. They can explain to the Pope the true reasons which have induced the parliaments to expel the Jesuits from France, and His Majesty to consent to it. Both envoys are so well informed on this subject that they need no instructions. They will thank the Holy Father for his impartiality and caution in the presence of certain Jesuits, whom His Holiness has ordered to be immediately expelled from Rome. But if His Holiness should wish to compel His Majesty to receive and restore the Jesuits in France, the envoys must apologize and declare that they are not authorized to negotiate in this manner. The Pope did not make the return of the Jesuits a condition for Henry's pardon, but, having reconciled him to the papal throne, he tried to obtain this return. We will speak of these events, which belong to the history of France, by following the Jesuits in other European countries. We will not speak now of their missions in Asia and America, so as not to interrupt the story of the great events in Europe. We will return to them later. Moreover, it was only in the 17th century that the Jesuits showed themselves in their missions in their true light, that is, as bold speculators, clever and enterprising traders, using religion as a veil to conceal their aims, which we will expose in all their nakedness with the help of indisputable documents.